Shri Sabyasachi Kar, RBI Chair Professor, Institute of Economic Growth, and all respected seniors and colleagues present here. I would now like to request Ms. Meera AP to present a bouquet to Dr. A.C. Kulshrestha, President IARNIW. Priyanka Pant to present a bouquet to ADG NAD. Alisha Khanam to present a bouquet to Brijendra Singh, DDG NAD. Ms. Priyanka Enjoy to present a bouquet to Anupam Prakash, Director RBI. At the outset, let me apprise you all about the Indian Association for Research in National Income and Wealth. IARNIW is an association of researchers in the field of national income and wealth and allied spheres. This association aims to encourage, stimulate, and undertake research in national income, wealth, and allied fields. The IARNIW organizes seminars and conferences from time to time in different parts of the country. This provides an opportunity for the participants to keep themselves updated with the recent developments taking place in the fields of national income. This also serves as an effective platform for discussing the emerging concepts, methodologies, framework, standards in compilation of national account statistics. With this brief introduction, I would now like to welcome Dr. A.C. Kulshrestha, President IARNIW. Dr. Kulshrestha has expertise in the field of national account statistics, economic statistics, informal sectors in national accounts, environmental accounting, official statistics, and design of experiments. Dr. Kulshrestha, retired Indian Statistical Service Officer, has served the Government of India in various capacities. He has been member of several advisory committees, working group of Government of India. He is patron of Society of Statistics and Computer Applications and life member of the Indian Society of Agricultural Statistics. Dr. Kulshrestha has been the recipient of prestigious Sankhiki Bhushan Award in 2015. He has published more than 100 research papers and also contributed chapters in books, international manuals, training manuals, and official publications. May I now request Dr. A.C. Kulshrestha, President IARNIW, to deliver the welcome address.
Can I speak from here? Hello? Is it audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'm very glad, very happy to see this seminar coming in the hybrid mode, because for quite some time we were having our activities online, and this is a hybrid mode, so both the people who could come in person and those who are joining us from their own offices are available. This time, this seminar, as mentioned, we have got 3 papers or 3 presentations for 1 hour each, which will include a presentation by the author and followed by discussions, so that we take real advantage of the topics. The first topic would be the system of national accounts, updations actually, by Shri Brijendra Singh from National Accounts Division, and the second presentation will be nowcasting India's GDP using weekly activity index by Dr. Anupam Prakash and Chitali Bhaumik from RBI, and the third presentation would be using regional data to analyze the growth and convergence in Indian economy by Professor Sabyasachi Kar, IEG. Well, as you all of you know that the activities of the IARNIW, Indian Association for Research in National Income and Wealth, we have the main activities, the conference which we have annually, in which all the members and other experts come and have presentations of their papers and other things. The seminar, we are having also another activity. In fact, in the earlier years, we used to have alternate years, a year for the conference, and then maybe the next year would be the seminar, and likewise it was going on. And slowly, I think we converted to the annual conference, but we have now revived again, and I think for quite some time we are having both the things together. I'm glad that I think more than 50 participants have joined us online, and maybe more. That's what I'm told the total number which were there, and I can see many of our colleagues at the screen that they are there. So the first about, I will just say a few words because I don't want to take time to talk about the topics, because the authors will have the presentations and they are the right people to say what they want to say. I will only make a request to our participants, whether present physically here or who have joined online, to see that our discussion takes place and to get the better points which are placed by them. So the system of national accounts paper is the presentation on not something new, but new in the sense that this is what being discussed. The system of national accounts, as you know, that has been made as early as 1953, which is supposed to be adopted by all countries, because it is has the adoption by the UNSC, United Nations Statistical Commission, and this is updated over time for the various reasons, and there have been really lots of changes in the national accounting. The first one was in 1953, and the second came after 25 years in 1968. Then another 25 years it came the 1993, and then after 1993 it was thought that let us do some kind of updation to take into account of the various new things which had come up, and to look review the production boundary or the asset boundaries and all those issues. Those kind of things were there, and also to, because there are lots of systems which are there in the United Nations. This is the system of national accounts is one, a balance of payment is another, government financial statistics is another. So lots of things talking about the economy, they should be well connected. They should not be talking differently. So the harmonization, those kind of things are there. Now that 2008 is also old, at that time, I was saying about the 93 updation. When it was updated a lot. And then I think the people thought that why necessarily call update of the 1993 SNA? Let's give a name 2008 SNA. Likewise, I find that now the 2008 SNA, the name which was given at the last stage, it is said by the UNSG, United Nations Statistics Division, not exactly that. Now they have got a combined body, not only UN alone, the 5 agencies, the World Bank, the IMF, those 5 agencies together, they form quorum, and that's what the advice comes. So they are again saying that some updation is required. So it is being said that this updation process is going on already. lots of task force are created. Details would be told by Brijesh, but I think those kind of things are there. This kind of discussion is going on, and expected that it would complete in 2025. I'm not sure whether this will remain the updation of the 2008 SNA, or maybe at that time thinking changes and we call it 2025 or whichever year it is completed. So all that. So in that there are lots of issues. Whereas the task force and there is another task force which is communicating among the task force. They will talk. So there are issues which requires consultations and from the national statistical offices around the world. So it is up to them whether they react only totally on their own, or they have little more discussions with the expertise or the knowledge or the users of national accounts point of view from the other experts in the countries. That UN will not do. That is the responsibility of the NSO to do that kind of things and take the collective wisdom and provide to the at the global level. So all those processes will go on. So my humble request would be to all of you, whether you are physically present here or joining us online, to provide your point of view, which I'm sure the NSO, the National Accounts Division, particularly in the NSO, will take a note of it and give our input. India has always been providing that kind of things in all the past. That's what I would say in my welcoming address to you, too, that I only welcome, and with the expectation that inputs will be provided by all of you in whatever way. If the time is short, we can find a way and means to get your views. Maybe that you could communicate to the IARNIW, because this kind of thing is being discussed at the our IARNIW, which is closely knitted with the tasks of the national accounts, particularly that take on. This is one aspect. Now the other presentations are very interesting presentation. The one is the now costing India's GDP using weekly activity indices. This is extension. I mean, in that sense, that what kind of data which is used. So national accounts is not only the following the guidelines provided by the SNA, which of course has to be done, but then in your country, in our country, I mean, in that sense particularly, how the data is organized. But not all data is readily available, and therefore we look to the related kind of indexes, because a theoretical concept to be given a number, and that number comes from where? If it comes directly from the official statistics, fine, that will have lots of criticism will always be there for all those things, but the best kind of things in that. So actually initially we were talking only the national accounts, which was the annual kind of concept. Slowly, I mean, not that the SNA had recommended that you prepare the quarterly estimates. The quarterly estimates, the idea came differently from the IMF actually, that they want to understand the economy position more frequently. So the quarterly estimates came, and then with the SDDS, it became part and parcel. If you have signed, and India signed that document, so now we are prepared to do that. And when the information is flowing slow and not to that year, not to that, sometimes not to that year also, the perfection, the revisions goes on. So in that some indexes are required. So what is the frequency of the indexes? What I understand from the topic, of course, Dr. Anupam will elaborate and place what it is and how useful it will be to the national accounts in that sense, that high frequency. And then from where to get, you are not getting information totally perfectly for all the items for the quarterly basis, how do you get then other high frequency, maybe weekly, daily, not of course hourly at the moment, but those kind of things are being talked about. So where are we and how do we go ahead and look onto those interesting aspects would come out from there. The third presentation by Professor Carr is of course not for the production of the national accounts number, but the use side of the national accounts. He is not talking really the national accounts, he is talking of the regional accounts. In that sense, those numbers and how frequently they are available. And in our case, the region could be any, but the region which we are talking in national accounting system by large is the state is taken as a region. So the state gross domestic product which is being taken, and he is using that to determine the growth and the convergence, but he is indicating that trying to cross check, validate, or do something else, a relationship established. This is a new aspect of this, using other than the official data which is which has been available so far, using night lights data. So we look forward to that, and then you're welcome to provide your comments to really see that can that be used when the data is not available for quicker estimates or some such things or otherwise. It's good to go beyond our traditional things which were going on if we get to improve. I think I'm not supposed to talk more. I'm supposed to really encourage all of you to participate actively, and thank the authors to make their presentations to provide us the inputs for this particular platform, and make the activity of the IARNIW for the seminar successful. We can have then more papers coming from various experts in the coming up the conference. With that, I would thank you again, and let the actual program begin with the lecture. You would be
Thank you, sir.
Inviting the guests.
Thank you, sir, for the encouraging words and setting the tone of the seminar. We are now geared up for the technical sessions of the day. We have 3 presentations in this seminar which are on System of National Accounts Update, nowcasting India's GDP using a weekly activity index, and using regional data to analyze the growth and convergence in Indian economy. Around 1 hour has been kept for each presentation, including questions and answers. As informed earlier, first presentation is on SNA updates, which will be delivered by Shri Brijendra Singh, Deputy Director General NED. Shri Brijendra Singh is an Indian Statistical Service Officer of 99 batch. He has worked in various ministries and departments, including Ministry of Corporate Affairs, Field Operation Division of NSO, Labour Bureau, Research and Publication Unit, etc. in different capacities. He is currently holding the post of Deputy Director General in the National Accounts Division of MOSPI. He has more than 6 years experience in national accounts and possesses vast knowledge and expertise in various aspects of national accounts. Currently, he is responsible for compilation of estimates of corporations, both financial and non-financial. He has authored insightful research papers in the field of national accounts. May I request you, sir, to please enlighten the gathering with your presentation.
Raju, can you get the presentation uploaded? Can you go to the first slide, please? Well, let me begin by qualifying that I am not actually the author of this presentation, because this is merely a collation of the discussions that are going around updation of SNA. Yes, I am just presenting the sort of summary of the discussions that are happening, and even in that, due to time constraint, I have not been able to include all the topics, and even in the topics included, I have not been able to include all the issues related to those topics. So, those of you who wish to go through these topics in much more detail, probably you should go through the guidance notes which are available in the public domain. I shall be giving the link to that during the course of the presentation. As per the current plan, the development of guidance note and country testing is expected to be completed by 2023, and the next version of SNA will be adopted by UNSC in 2025. Just let me check if I am able to navigate. Are you changing the slides from there? Strange. Okay. Okay. So go to the initial slide, please. Okay, let me start from here itself. We all know that SNA 2008 is up for updation, and the broad categories that are being actually considered in the ongoing research are regarding measuring well-being, globalization and digitalization. I shall also briefly touch upon the issue of communication towards the end. However, I shall not cover more esoteric topics like financial issues, current account balance of payment, etc. There are various sub-dimensions within each of the three categories that I shall be taking up. Some of the recommendations of the task team pertain to the existing framework of the SNA and differ only in terms of emphasizing whatever is already existing or in increasing the granularity in dissemination, while others deal with broadening the scope of SNA itself and recording new types of stocks and flows. The discussions generally hinge around whether the recommendations, if accepted, should be housed in the core SNA framework or in the extended accounts. Next, please. This is a snapshot of UNSTAT's web page wherein all guidance notes have been uploaded. They are about 70 odd guidance notes in numbers, and they also include guidance at various stages, that is the initial draft, the global consultations and the final final document that has been endorsed by advisory expert group. Next, please. The way in which the presentation is organized is that first a snapshot of various sub-dimensions or the issues within each of the three categories will be presented. The issues will also be contextualized through examples if required, and finally the recommendations will be wrapped off in brief. Next, please. Let us begin with the issue of well-being, which is the most critical element brought into increased focus by the Commission of Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress, generally referred to as Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission. The issues related to measurement of well-being generally fall into discussions concerning measurement of unpaid household services, which are so far outside the production boundary of SNA, issues related to distribution of household income, consumption and wealth, issues related to environmental accounting, whether we account for depletion of natural resources, etc., and issues related to inclusion of labor accounts, health accounts and education accounts within the core SNA framework or in the extended accounts. Next, please. Promotion of distributional characteristics in the ongoing discussions related to SNA largely center around distributions of household income, consumption and wealth. This is something which is encouraged by Data Gap Initiative 2 as well. Left horizontal bar chart in the slide shows how the dissemination of information pertaining to household is envisaged, not as an aggregate but as a distribution across various percentiles. As household incomes or consumption going up in the aggregate may not always necessarily mean that more people are better off, as increase might be in the percentile that was already very affluent. The chart on the right is an example of such disparities. It indicates real disposable income growth during 2007 to 2014 and its two component periods, that is 2007 to 10 and 10 to 14, corresponding to the period of economic slump and recovery around the global financial crisis which happened in around 2008. We see that after 2010, when GDP in OECD region resumed growing, the growth in disposable income of bottle decile was least, that is 1.1%, though it recorded steepest decline of 5.3% during the period around financial crisis, that is in 2008. Hence, if we merely look at the average aggregates, we will find that the hardships of the bottom decile would be significantly understated in the period around financial crisis, whereas their recovery after the same will be overstated. Next, please. Now, let us take an example of discussion around well-being that seeks to expand the scope of SNA rather than just emphasizing the details already within its ambit. Inclusion of unpaid household services. This so far has been outside the coverage of SNA, and it is expected that it will lead to an increase in level of GDP, but it may not always result in higher growth rates vis-a-vis the unimputed ones as shown in the table. This might happen since as more proportion of people join labor force for paid work, the share of unpaid workers available for additional imputation in GDP decreases. Next, please. Now, coming to the recommendations related to unpaid household services, these include estimation of extended measures of GDP factoring in household production to complement existing measures of GDP using a satellite account, and incorporation of both monetary and physical units of production, that is time, to create extended additional SUTs. It is being recommended that both these elements of supplementary information should be completed once in every 5 years. For the purposes of measuring unpaid household services, only such services shall be deemed productive as can be delegated to paid worker, or the third party criterion is to be followed. Some subcategories have been identified for unpaid household services like child and adult care, nutrition, shopping, etc. Formal volunteering has been kept out of scope of unpaid household services, and it is recommended that complete record of time may be estimated to track societal change with no production boundary cutoff, that is time spent on sleeping, etc. must also be recorded in the tables related to time use. Next, please. Two types of approaches have been identified for measurement, that is output approach and input approach. The latter includes approaches like replacement cost, opportunity cost, etc. A replacement cost approach of valuation of hours worked is generally recommended for gross wage rates with use of specialist wage rates, but not those pertaining to highly qualified people.
That slide is not moving. Slide is not moving.
Yes, presently the slide should be showing two methods, output and input method. So we are on the same slide. For online participants,
Slides are not moving.
For online participants, maybe there is an issue. So it is being controlled from behind. So shall I proceed?
So can
Are you able to see? So are you able to see online?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so go ahead.
Okay, so I was on the two methods of valuation for unpaid household services. Whereas input method requires regular data flow on time use data, output method requires wide range of data sources for consumption of service and market equivalent prices besides reliable household expenditure survey for IC. It is recommended that input approach should be adopted for valuations of unpaid work using main activities recorded by a harmonized time use survey. Next, please. Is the slide moving for online participants now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Recommendations regarding distributional characteristics include that microdata or survey data may be used for deriving distributional characteristics of household income. Recommendations regarding distributional characteristics include that microdata may be used for deriving distributional characteristics of households. Focus should be on households, not individuals, and even within households on non-institutional ones, as their characteristics might be different from institutional households. However, in some cases like predominantly aged population residing in old age homes, institutional households may also be relevant. To make this information on households comparable, households must first be equalized.
Not audible, please.
I think so. Yes. Am I audible now? Am I audible now? Am I audible to the online participants now?
You're audible, sir. You're audible.
Okay,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
okay, thank you. Can you go to the relevant slide, please? Okay, so recommendations regarding distributional characteristics include that microdata may be used for deriving distributional characteristics of household income, consumption and wealth, and focus should be on households, not individuals, and even within households on non-institutional ones. And to make the information on households comparable, households must first be equalized for different consumption needs of different sizes and composition, and different methods including, for example, dividing by square root of the household size, or using modified OECD scale which assigns value of 1 to household head, 0.5 to each additional adult member who are aged 14 years and above, and 0.3 to each child, etc. may be used. The recommendations for purposes of distributional account by OECD expert group on income, consumption and wealth include changing the treatment of purchase of lottery and non-life insurance, non-life premiums as consumption instead of current transfer, and income from these as capital transfer instead of current transfers. It is also recommended that durables may be recorded separately from current consumption for purposes of compiling distributional results, although in the SNA the same may be left unchanged, and the wealth may include social security pension entitlements and stock of durables like cars, yachts, planes, etc. Further, even though inter-household flows may get netted in overall aggregate of household sector, it would be worthwhile to record these flows for distributional purposes. Individual distributional characteristics, usually with age as one of the dimension, is dealt with by national transfer accounts. Next, please. Recommendations surrounding CR include netting for natural resource depletion besides CFC and emphasizing the use of net figures instead of gross measures. SNA presently includes this under other changes in volume accounts, whereas CR recommends to treat it as cost of production. Splitting the ownership between public and private is also recommended in cases where risks and rewards are shared by both, instead of recording all ownership to general government. While seeking more clarity on distinguishing between produced and non-produced biological resources, the recommendations include making a distinction between migrating and non-migrating biological resources, and always treating migrating resources, for example fish in open waters, as a non-produced asset. For non-migrating resources, two options are considered, with the first option being a strict application of the significance of management practices, whereby production may be restricted only to assets under substantive human control, and option 2 under option 2, treatment of all biological resources which is non-migrating is treated as cultivated. Another alternative being considered is to treat natural resources as a separate class of assets and biological resources as a breakup of the same, thereby not having to make this distinction between produced and non-produced resources. Regarding renewable energy assets, it is being recommended that renewable energy resources under certain conditions, say allowing their commercial use under existing technological and economic conditions, may be recognized as separate category of assets under natural resources in the revised SNA. Thus, air current in which no wind turbine currently stands is not an economic asset. Residual value method is recommended for valuation, which is the net present value of future stream of rent. This method is recommended for mineral and non-renewable non-renewable energy resources as well, and it is recommended that mineral and non-renewable energy resources may be I mean this slide only, so I mean it is yet to move, I think. And it is recommended that mineral and non-renewable energy resources may be delineated into 3 resource classes as in system of environmental accounts, that is commercially recoverable resources, potentially commercially recoverable resources, and non-commercial and other known deposits subject to the availability of data. Next please. The recommendations on issues of labor, health and education accounts include inclusion of labor accounts in core framework with information on jobs, people which is labor force employment etc., volume and payments. The people quadrant may include demographic breakdown by gender, age and educational attainment. Labor accounts will also include non-monetary measures besides the monetary measures. It is recommended that satellite or extended accounts on education and training and human capital may be produced, treating human knowledge and capabilities as an asset. Presently, SNA excludes human capital from the asset boundary. Translation into skill and competencies etc. that matters. Own account production, that is in-house training education services, should be imputed as secondary output and allocated to intermediate consumption. No change is proposed in the core SNA in case of education accounts. In 2016, the UNECE published guides on measuring human capital, and the guide discusses 2 approaches for valuing human capital, either the cost-based approach or lifetime income approach. The cost-based approach uses the cost of generating human capital, that is expenditures on education, as the starting point, while the lifetime income approach tries to estimate the value of human capital by calculating the net present value of future earnings. Recommendations related to health accounts include inclusion of classification of functions and providers from system of health account into system of national accounts, which will be dealt with through with the extended accounts. Treatment of own account production of occupational health services as secondary output and IC instead of CE. This will leave the GDP unaffected but would allow measuring of health output and consumption. Supplements to SNA 2008 include measuring related unpaid services and preparation of supplementary SUTs for healthcare and long-term social care. Next please. Next, maybe we can skip this. The second area that is being discussed for comprehensively capturing the economic development is digitalization. It can include a narrow view of the digital economy as simply the output of digital goods and services, which is broadly ICT, to a broader view including all output from production that utilizes these digital goods and services. Alternately, the OECD, WTO, IMF framework also includes perspective from the consumer side by incorporating digital ordering and delivery, besides inclusion of non-monetary information and data, which is presently outside the SNA production boundary. But none of the categorization in isolation would give a complete picture. For example, many ICT products are sold in person, hence using an online ordering and delivery as a criteria would exclude them from being considered under digital economy. Also nowadays, very little if any production is totally digital free. Therefore, production technology based definition with no additional disaggregation would likely incorporate a substantial amount of the economy, limiting the amount of new information it can provide. Digital SUT's approach seems to be the ideal to, as it deals with the issues more comprehensively, recommending breakdown of supply and use on nature of transaction and identifying additional digital industries and products. Next, please. No, it was already, I think, on the next slide. Can you go to the previous one? Even one slide, yes. The primary issues related to broad area of digitalization concern those related to classification. For example, how digital intermediaries should be classified, whether data should be treated as an asset, how free products like Wikipedia etc. should be considered, whether conventional methods of measuring price and volume adequately reflect the true picture, how should crypto assets be treated, and guidance related to covering digital activities comprehensively through digital SUTs. Next. Let us take an example on issues related to volume and price measure. Suppose people shift from voice telephony to Skype, however the total volume of telecommunication service remains same. Also suppose charges for traditional call is more than those for internet based applications like Skype. Now in such a scenario, if we use last year's index for base year prices along with current year volume for constant price estimates, we get a decline of around 80% in volume. By contrast, using simple aggregate unit value calculation shows a decline of 80% in price index between year 1 and 2 and no change in volume of calls. And this is making more intuitive sense. Next, please. We can skip this next. Coming to recommendations related to digitalizations, we have already discussed that the digital SUTs provide most comprehensive coverage of digital economy. In preparation of digital SUTs, it is recommended that 5 additional rows may be given below each product representing nature of transaction, that is digitally ordered via e-commerce, direct from counterparty, via intermediary platforms, not digitally ordered, and digitally delivered. 7 additional industry columns are proposed for new digital industries like digitally enabling industries, which are ICT industries, digital intermediaries, firms dependent on intermediaries like Uber drivers, e-tailers, advertisement platforms like Facebook, TikTok, producers operating only digitally like Netflix, and digital only firms providing financial and insurance services like PayPal and Lendbox. It is recommended that 4 additional rows be created to represent the digital products already existing within the SNA production boundary, which are the ICT products, priced digital services excluding cloud computing and digital intermediary services, and 3 additional rows representing data and digital services presently outside SNA production boundary. Next, please.
Previous slide, please.
Okay. Data. Regarding data, the same is considered as a non-produced asset presently, as the SNA 2008 specifies that databases should be valued on a sum of costs basis and only reflect the cost of preparing data in appropriate format, but not the cost of acquiring or producing the underlying data. However, there seems to be a bit of contradiction in SNA, as it also says that databases for sale should be valued at their market price, which includes the value of information content. The alternatives recommended going forward is either to classify data as the new intangible asset, or at least include the cost of acquiring or producing the data in the cost of purchasing database. In case data is classified as an intangible asset, purchase of short-lived data with life less than 1 year would constitute IC, and only those with life more than 1 year may be treated as fixed asset. Regarding the ownership, the same would rest with the producer and not with the entity to which it refers, not with the owner of the storage. On issues pertaining to valuation, it is recommended that cost approach may be used for own production, whereas market prices may be used for purchase data. Increase in value of data may be adjusted through revaluation account, whereas new uses may be adjusted through other changes in volume account. Data can be stored in digital as well as non-digital format. However, the subgroup recommends the exclusion of non-digitalized data from the SNA production and asset boundaries for practical reasons. Also, publicly available data or data accessed free of charge is still considered as an asset for the producer, but not for the consumer. Next, please. Regarding valuation of free products like Wikipedia, different approaches are being used. For example, advertising revenues, consumers' willingness to pay, cost of such supply of such services by market producers, or developer time approach as in case of free softwares. For user generated content, largely two approaches are being used: bundling approach that does not require any imputation, and barter approach. In bundling approach, the main argument is that value is already included via markups on the advertised product, whereas barter approach assumes that consumer and businesses receive free content in exchange for exposure to advertising or marketing. It is also recommended that payment to access non-produced information like observable phenomena should be treated as rent. Next, please. This figure clarifies the barter approach. Barter approach assumes no consumer surplus. The value of free services produced by a company equals the value of rent foregone by a consumer related to acquisition of his personal data by the company. So the GV of the company increases, but it pays equal imputed rent, leaving aside its savings unaffected. Household consumes imputed value of free services, and the same is offset by imputed rent that would accrue to him for his personal data, so his savings are also not affected, though his consumption has increased. Task team recommended no need for changes in the core SNA framework, but preparation of a satellite account with the scope restricted to free digital products only. In these accounts also, the guidance note treated exchange of free digital product for user generated content as a barter transaction. Next, please. Classification of digital intermediaries is another issue that is being discussed, and the same is already being considered in next version of International Industrial Classification ISIC. After considering the alternative for creation of separate classification for intermediation services, the discussions seem to favor the alternative of defaulting the intermediation services to the group whose products they are intermediating. This is in agreement with the current guidance on the issue. Thus, Uber would be treated as a transportation company and Airbnb as an accommodation provider. Regarding coverage, there are apprehensions that traditional surveys are not capturing digitally enabled services. Also, large portions of such services are with the agents in different countries, which calls for cross-border arrangements of data flow. Next, please. In view of time constraints, maybe we can skip this. Even this one. Crypto assets also, they largely pertain to categorization of crypto assets as various financial instruments and valuables in some cases, so we can skip this. Valuation of imports and exports, treatment of special purpose entities and multinational enterprises, treatment of marketing assets in SNA and BPM, etc. are the main topics that were being discussed by the task team on globalization. Next, please. Let us now consider the classic case of Ireland that finds place in most discussions on globalization. In 2015, Irish GDP rising by 32.4% in current prices and 26.3% at constant prices stunned everyone. The main reason for the particularly high Irish GDP growth rates lied in the fact that in preceding years, attracted in large part by low corporation taxes, a large number of big multinational corporations relocated their activities and more specifically their underlying IPPs to Ireland. As a result, sales generated from the use of these IPP now contributed to Irish GDP rather than to the other country's GDP. Given the size of these companies, the boost to GDP growth was large. Further, Irish enterprises involved contract manufacturers, including those domiciled outside Ireland, to produce final products using the blueprint from IPPs. The subsequent distribution and sale of these products organized by the Irish enterprises resulted in value addition being created in the Irish economy. However, profit was repatriated by Irish affiliates of the foreign MNEs. Hence, a lot of what constituted the GDP was transferred back to different countries, resulting only in modest increase in aggregates of net national income and disposable income of households. This anomaly was manifested in per capita Irish GDP being well above the OECD average, whereas per capita Irish household income being well below it. Next, please. Previous example contextualized the importance of handling globalization in general and MNEs in particular. Recommendations regarding MNEs relate to, MNEs is multinational enterprises, MNEs relate to increasing granularity in presentation of national account aggregates, emphasizing other existing indicators besides GDP, and exploring alternative presentations or extensions to the core SNA framework. Next, please. As GNI, GNDI and NNI are less sensitive to impact of globalization, it is recommended that they should be emphasized more rather than merely focusing on GDP. The chart of few OECD countries shows that for countries like Ireland and Luxembourg, GDP is significantly higher than GNI, indicating that a lot of income flows outside these countries and isn't available to the resident households. In case of increasing globalization, divergence between GDP and GNI can be significant, as is already reflected by Luxembourg, where the GDP is about 160% of the gross national income. Next, please. The present slide indicates the granularity at which the reporting of aggregates is recommended. For example, instead of merely reporting non-financial corporate sector, it should be further bifurcated into domestically controlled non-financial corporations and foreign controlled NFCs. And domestic NFCs may be further split into public and private NFCs, and within each group, domestic multinationals should also be segregated. It is being considered whether extended institutional sector accounts and SUTs should be prepared, or only GVA should be further split by type of institutional units. Also, whether more granular information might be required for financial assets and liabilities. The recommendations of the task team on globalization do not propose any change to the core framework, whereas alternative presentation on the basis of nationality is proposed in external sector accounts. Next, please. This is another example on how new insights are revealed once more granular data becomes available. This chart clearly reveals that in case of foreign NFCs, profit component is much more compared to CE, whereas the case reverses for domestic NFCs. It shows that a large part in case of NFCs is siphoned outside Ireland, and only a small fraction accrues to the resident households in form of CE. Next, please. Regarding valuation of exports and imports, three options were being considered to solve the apparent inconsistency between FOB prices for imports and exports recommended presently by SNA and output valuation at basic prices for domestic transactions. The options include never integrating transport services with the goods with the value of goods, maintaining FOB type valuation of imports and exports, and using observed transactional values or invoice values. The advantages of the first case is that it would result in consistent valuation of domestic and international transaction. However, it would require changes in concepts like basic producer and purchaser's price and treatment of transport margin in SUTs. Presently, SNA recommends both exports and imports be valued at FOB. Hence, continuing with option 2 will not require fresh efforts. However, such valuation will not fully reconcile with the valuing of output at basic prices and with the treatment of domestic transactions. The third option, favored theoretically by majority of the task team members, is to use transaction or invoice values. It would enhance the consistency within SNA with the general valuation principle of recording output at basic prices. However, at a practical level, members expressed concerns about the considerable challenges associated with the implementation of this recommendation, as the widespread availability of transaction value in custom records is not very clear. Next, please. Emergence of SPs has brought increased focus on them. These exist as legal entities without any significant physical presence. The discussion on SPs primarily relates to formally defining the SPs or special purpose entities, whether they should be considered at their residence or along with the parent country, whether we should have more granularity of information like SPs as per nationality, etc. Next, please. The main characteristics of SPs endorsed by BOPCOM or Committee on Balance of Payment is that they are formally registered and hence recognized as institutional units, have up to maximum of 6 employees, little physical presence or physical production in the host economy, and are directly or indirectly controlled by non-residents. They are established to reduce risk, tax burden, to access capital markets, etc. They transact almost entirely with non-residents, and large parts of their balance sheet show cross-border claims and liabilities. Next, please. Recommendations on SPs include recording them at their place of incorporation, adding subsector of foreign controlled SPs in institutional sector accounts, and nationality based framework to complement residence based framework for countries where SPs are important. Besides acting as shell companies, SPs may perform certain financial and non-financial activities. Shell companies are used for passing through funds between non-residents with no operations in the economic territory of incorporation. They usually don't have employees, are not traded, and can be kept dormant. Next, please. Both the System of National Accounts 2008 and the Balance of Payment Manual BPM 6 currently classifies marketing assets as non-produced non-financial assets. International Accounting Standard 38 defines the treatment of marketing assets in commercial accounting, which is also in agreement with SNA 2008. Presently, two major conceptual issues being discussed with respect to marketing assets are to whether they should be maintained as being non-produced non-financial assets or could be re-examined as produced non-financial assets. If marketing assets are reclassified as produced assets, then there is no longer an element of property income to franchisee fee payments. BPM 6 would need an updation to remove the advice as to where possible record a portion of the transaction as primary income. Like other produced non-financial assets, the outright acquisition or sale of creation of a marketing asset would be recorded for national accounts in the as a capital formation, gross fixed capital formation in the capital accounts. If marketing assets are to be maintained as non-produced, then consistent guidance is recommended in SNA and BPM. 2008 SNA does not give any specific advice on how to record franchisee fee payments, or more broadly how to record payments for non-produced non-financial assets other than natural resources, whereas BPM 6 indicates separating the income and service elements. It is also necessary to consider why BPM 6 defaults to consider recording the whole transaction as charges for use of IPP when a split is not possible. The option should be to record the entire franchisee fee as a property income where there is no element of service being provided. Regarding outright acquisition sale, when a non-produced marketing asset is traded, it is to be recorded as acquisition or disposal of non-produced asset in capital account. If marketing assets are non-produced, they are not brought into existence via production process. Hence, no specific recording for creation of asset is required. Next, please. Okay, communication task team has been deliberating on an assessment framework to measure alignment with economic, social, statistical standards, aligning of terminology in different manuals like SNA, BPM and GFSM, promoting user-friendly terminology, branding and more targeted communication of products like publication with high technical dimensions for specialists, publications with only headline results and few methodological elements for general public, and releases with lowest technical dimension for decision makers and generalists, etc. The task team has also come up with guidance on taxonomy for communicating economic statistics releases, products and product updates. For example, what constitutes a regular, benchmark or a comprehensive revision. Decomposition of an update into its element, and two-tier taxonomy for communicating product quality, with first tier including official statistics and provisional estimates, and the second tier including experimental estimates. That's all in the presentation for the time being. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon all. So let me first begin by expressing my sincere thanks to sir for sharing his knowledge with us on the topic of SNA update. So any comments or question on this presentation are welcome.
Have you taken note of online comments? Rajiv, online comments, queries?
Yep.
First of all, we did not hear the presentation at all. It was not at all audible. How can we raise questions? Yeah, that was the question with me too.
Mhm.
I could not hear.
But going forward, at least can we address this problem? Otherwise, they
And the SNA changes, what are their impact on our national accounts? I have one general question. Am I audible, please?
Yes, sir.
You see, sometime back, 4 or 5 years back, the Review of Income and Wealth brought out a special issue on the future of national accounts. Now, there they have mentioned about the building up of the national accounts from the micro level. 2 or 3 papers on that aspect. Now, how far this Indian economy is sustaining that data capture, I really do not know. That's a very major issue which is discussed in the international conference, and 2 papers are there on that aspect. The second problem is about they are talking. You are talking about the inter-household flows. Inter-household flows is extremely difficult to get. It is of course there are so many things which are yet to be discussed, particularly the the new SNJ which is being thought of. They are discussing about the distributional aspects of consumption, wealth, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, for that you have to have the disaggregated data from the grassroots levels. Now, how far is it feasible in the present data capture and processing? Thank you.
It may not, the light may not be there, but
I mean, thanks for the good presentation and especially trying to educate us on what's happening globally. But this debate on the OECD's initiative of well-being has been going on for the last few years. And I think, so Dr. Kulshev will bear me out, when the 2008 was being discussed, India had given a lot of inputs for to the intersecretariat working group on national accounts. And since India is now in a better position digitally, plus new surveys in position like the time use survey is there, the next one should be in the planning stage if it's not already been done. But looking at the panorama of activities that needs or will need to have be captured when the new SNA comes in, is it not a time that the NSO thinks about doing surveys for futuristic indicators to cover some of these aspects? And now the Reserve Bank is also here, since they're trying to plan out the CBDC, the central bank digital currency. It's a time for the NSO to sit down with the Reserve Bank and look at protocols to be captured which can help measuring the digital economy. So it's a lot of work in terms of the NSO's mandate. But a lot of these aspects, you have the GSTN, you have the e-way bill for the trade and transport margin. A lot of that data needs to get more richer for the statistical purposes. So this is the time that NSO should actually be having active engagements with these institutions and entities to be able to be future ready for the new SNA. And you don't have to wait for the SNA to be approved. You can also create your satellite account and go ahead. Thank you.
Can I say something? It's a good presentation, and in fact it gives us a direction in which we should proceed. He mentioned that they have been circulating some guidance notes, etc. I think all NSOs must be already been online with them, or are we participating in any sense? Because initially some request for such kind of information had come. After that, are we really involved in any of the further task forces, etc., or task teams which they are calling? I mean, what is the extent of NSO's involvement in the task teams that they have already mentioned here? Are we getting our from anything from either UNSC or UNSD or I mean, just wanted to know what is our extent of involvement, or we are getting only to fill up their questionnaires, etc. Only that is the level of participation we are having.
Well, sir, that is largely the case because the task teams have. Yes. The task teams have already been constituted, but whatever initial agenda was considered by the task team, then it was up for a global consultation, and during that process, as you are rightly saying, that they prepare various alternatives, the relevance of various issues and data availability in different countries, because they don't want to come up with a alternative which is theoretically very good, but no country is able to implement it. So it is through that process of consultative engagement through the form of questionnaires where they seek information from all the countries, which they collate and publish also, and then they probably use that as an input for the final draft that goes to the advisory expert group. We are just engaged in that capacity only. We are not directly member of any task team per se.
If I may add to that, see, it's not a question of being passively involved, it's a question of being proactively involved.
I have a question on the
What I was just trying to add is that if you collect the data, produce some estimates and tell the committee this is how we have done it, it could be globally adopted. This is what other countries are doing for BRICS and SDGs. Why not India? We are far ahead in terms of the digitalization of the economy. So you can plan for future surveys, make yourself future ready, and prepare the estimates accordingly. Suggestion only.
This point for the futuristic survey, you know the points which are likely to come, and you know the position. If you don't do it now, then later on you will say we don't have, so nothing will happen. So I think this point needs to be placed, recommended from this platform to the NSO, or Nivedita can take a note of it, to say that, because it's a mechanism, not that she will conduct the survey. At least the planning stage somebody has to initiate, then it will go to the respective body and create data. That should not be put aside. That's very important point.
Like in the time use survey, we got it approved, it has to happen every 3 years.
Yes.
PLFS we're supposed to have a module for adding things, and when you have to query labor accounts, you don't have the wage data. So there is a gap which and you have a platform to make it available.
Yeah, because the time use survey will only talk about the timings based on survey. Yeah, that quantification has to be given a thought, otherwise only the proxies would be put for this, which will always be deliberated, and we have that problem for quite some time.
Then at least you have a denominator.
Yes.
So you can do a topical survey for data for it.
Yeah, I think that's something that should not go in vain. This kind of recommendations, you are at the head of the the NSO for some time, so these needs to be communicated to the new chief of our the NSO chief, the national statistician, and we should recommend. So I hope you take a note of it. Who else was the? I think Subbarao was. No, Dr. Shetty was saying. Dr. Shetty, you want to set some?
I have a general question, because I am not privy to the institutional arrangement of the NAD now. Earlier there used to be advisory committee of national account, and there used to be some kind of consultation among academicians, and they used to, the CSO and NAD used to share the views of the advisory committee. Now I just want them because I am not lost touch with this because of my health reasons. I'll be grateful if you could kindly tell me how the NAD is functioning now.
Okay, your point is noted. I will request Nivedita to respond to this note. let's complete the discussions on the Brijendra's presentation. Will that be okay for you? Okay. Anybody else who wants to raise a point? Naresh?
Thank you very much. Presentation is good, but only thing is that how far we could even implement the SNA 93 so far.
93?
How far we could implement the SNA 93 itself?
No, 2008.
No, even 2008 or 93 even. Because the NPI so far has not been segregated, which is a major statistical institution. Number two, the household consumption or household output even in the goods, we are unable to cover large amount of that by the household members. Then regarding
goods part is anyway. You have your point. Goods part is covered mostly, but on the service part.
Good part is covered because of the labor force. I know construction or the other manufacturing, etc. I know those covers are.
Yeah, you will have always something on that, but at least something is there. But services, there is nothing,
also,
which is being talked now. But anyway,
my point is that so many things they have suggested in the new SNA, but for a country like ours, where the data is not there for so many things, and the NSSO is always raising their head, we can't do it. We know our recent survey on the saving on the household, they are only having 256 households, and the working group is working from the 2010 until 2022. No report, final report, only the some pilot survey has been done.
Saving investment.
Household saving investment. So after 12 years even, the results are not coming for the pilot survey, where the only 256 samples are to be collected. My point is only that so much information they want, but without understanding the limitations of the country. Number two, they are saying that you take the growth of NNI instead of GNI. I feel that since this depreciation or the consumption of fixed capital is calculated at a different way in the different industries and different countries, so GDPI or GNI is better indicator than the NNI for the growth, because this depreciation is this consumption of fixed capital is deducted from the GNI to the NNI, and this calculation of the CFC has not been stabilized over the countries. So many countries are using book value or some asset value, or our country itself is doing the life system, which may not be very good also. So NNI is not very good indicator, but the GNI is very good indicator for the calculation of the growth. NNI, where you are adding the GDP depreciation, which is not the correct way. Only from the GDPI you could consume the consumption of fixed capital, and you get the NNI. And this estimation of the CFC itself is a very difficult job on a uniform basis. So we should not go for the NNI as a growth indicator. We should remain at the GDI as a good indicator. That's all. Thank you very much.
yeah, I think your point needs something, and I will be very grateful to you if you could write something and in the next one, so that the NAD is able to take it with the UN SD. Yeah. I mean, that's something, because if you say now, it may not get the light of the day. Thank you very much. Okay, is that time enough? Okay.
We can have
Okay, so I hope we have taken note of all the points. So if whatever points can be responded now, because we are running short of time also, we can see. So I think to respond, some of the points have been responded. Vijendra, you want to respond to some points now, or you would say that I have taken a note of it, I cannot answer?
So regarding this gross and net measures, I would like to say that when the net measures are being recommended, it is largely with context to environmental accounting and also including the depletion of natural resources, not only CFC. So from that perspective, probably they are talking that net aggregate should be emphasized. And anyway, they are also agreeing that there should be a shift from GDP, especially for the countries where there is a lot of globalization and multinational corporations are operating. There should be a shift from GDP to national income or disposable income. So that is agreed. But therein, gross and net differentiation is not that important in the context of globalization only. It is in the context of taking this depletion of natural resources into account, like CFC. Then we talk about emphasizing the net indicators.
No, excuse me. Excuse me. The depletion of natural resources arises only when you are including the growth of the natural resources in the GDP. Only then the depletion will arise. And it is always equal. Let me tell you. I told in the environmental account also that depletion and increase is always equal in the natural assets. Once the bird has been killed, it is consumed, and bird has been removed from the natural resources. Bird has been produced, it is produced, and it is another bird has been killed. So there is no consumption of capital of the natural resources, no production of the natural resources.
I think that point, anyway, now they are trying to have some kind of linkages with the
environmental account also.
Yes, I appreciate that point of thing. So that point cannot be forgotten. But I thought the main point with this presentation was to note down the points which this body is suggesting to the NSO to consider them and to communicate to the UN at this stage, right?
It is better to circulate the note among the persons along with this presentation, because we are not having the written part. Hard copies are not there.
The hard copy is not there, but I would request the hard copies to be communicated maybe by email.
Paper should be circulated. This is only a presentation.
All the guidance notes actually are available in public
Actually,
domain.
I'm sorry, this may
based
be
on the topic of the guidance note and your area of interest, probably you can just have a look at those guidance notes only. Otherwise, they are, too many, about maybe running into thousands of pages. So, no, there are separate individual guidance notes on each topic, like one for data, one for. Some of them have been endorsed by advisory expert group, but mostly they are at still consultation level only. So they are available by topic of interest, like data is one, then free products is another, and so on and so forth.
So in short, looks like that this is not that your 2025 thing is available to us and we can provide you for comment. It is not that stage. This is being discussed. So it's a question of some kind of our input which goes there to take into account. Oh, you are considering this. These are the points. So all those things will be done. They don't have a ready-made final draft or something which they have received from there and you can communicate. That's why, and I understand. But if there is any, I think it will be to the interested people, or this association can do that. Those either you provide the links to our interested experts, and that's what you can do. There is no at this time we don't talk of hard copies. Okay.
So even if you Google SNA update web page, you will get the link always. Invariably, it takes you to that page.
So he wants to directly communicate to you instead of.
May I?
Yeah, please. Yeah, you have to respond to at least Praveesh's point to take into account the futuristic survey. That's something very important. And
thank you for all the very responses and very good suggestions and your wisdom and thoughts on this presentation. Actually, the very purpose of making this presentation, as Brijendra said at the outset, that he has just tried to collect on behalf of NSO, he had tried to collect the glimpses of the discussions and some decisions that are being taken, and they are so varied and wide in nature, and many of them are so fluid even now. So he had tried to go through an avalanche of material to give a very quick overview and a glimpse of the major issues and major concerns of the SNA Update 2025, and to examine all those in detail and their applicability is another detailed work. Many of the members of IARNIW were feeling that we need to have some overview of the glimpses of the proposed revision of SNA. So that was, he just tried to give the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is still there and we are perhaps not seeing it now. That is one part. And of course, National Accounts Division is trying to do its, consider all these aspects in their regular accounts estimation. But as you rightly pointed out, have we achieved 93 SNA in full, 2005 SNA in full, but still there is an ongoing continuous and continual improvement. So that is coming to Praveen sir's point that of course these some futuristic surveys can be thought of, are being thought of, not only can be, are being thought of, and not only surveys, now internationally also they are trying to go beyond surveys and trying to go beyond the traditional sources. And in fact, our next lecture will give some glimpse of some new way of going about it, because COVID had taught us many new things. This is after almost 3 years now we are having a in-person seminar. In the meantime, we had some online virtual seminars, and even today when so many of you could not attend it fully or could not listen to the main part of the lecture, we know the limitations of such virtual interactions. So in view of all these infirmities, this is the effort to come together. And today, though more than 75 people registered, we had most of them, majority of them are joining us online. So we are trying to reach out to all of you to listen to your wisdom and enrich ourselves with your guidance. And that is one of the very purpose of organizing this seminar. Thank you.
Okay, so you have something left to respond, or
it's okay.
All the questions you covered, the questions raised, or you will note down the.
We can.
Okay. So okay, because of the time. Is it okay? Because of the time constraint, it will not be possible, I think, to respond to each individual who have given very important points to us. We will be able to respond to you in few course. The points have been noted down. So if that is the first presentation, it's time to move on to the second topic. Could you?
Thank you, everyone. So the topic of next presentation is nowcasting India's GDP using a weekly activity index, and it will be presented by Dr. Anupam Prakash, Ms. Chaitali Bhaumik, and Mr. Ishu Thakur. Dr. Prakash is currently working as Director of National Accounts Analysis Division in the Department of Economic and Policy Research of the Reserve Bank of India. She has a work experience of 26 years in the RBI in various areas including national accounts, banking, prices, and international relations. Ma'am has represented the RBI in meetings of the Advisory Committee on National Accounts and is a regular participant in discussions with various national and international agencies which include the IMF, OECD, G20, other central banks, and various credit rating agencies. Ms. Chaitali Bhaumik is working as manager in the National Accounts Analysis Division, Department of Economic and Policy Research since 2017. She has been working extensively on the real sector, particularly involved in the periodic growth projections with noticeable contributions made in the monthly bulletins and the report on currency and finance 2021-22. Mr. Ishu Thakur joined the RBI as manager in 2019 with a prior experience in industry as well as academics. Being a part of the National Accounts Analysis Division, he is currently involved in the compilation of financial stocks and flow of funds of the economy, as well as the quarterly household financial savings. May I now invite Dr. Prakash, Ms. Chaitali Bhaumik and Mr. Ishu Thakur for presenting their paper.
I will do the introduction from here. Am I audible now? Yeah. So I will give introduction to our work, and then Chaitali and Ishu will take us through the presentation. So the preceding presentation has in fact laid down, the contours on which we all have to work in the times to come, and the SNA updates, they are all dealing with very difficult to measure kind of areas, environment, well-being and digital. These are really challenging, but as Praveen sir has said, that India has its own advantages, especially digital. Yesterday we were with the GSTN team, and I had this thought of why not form a group involving the national accounts team of RBI, the NSO, NAD and GSTN, so that we could engage in some futuristic projects as well. So so much so for that, and let me now highlight the long-standing association of Reserve Bank of India with IARNIW forum, which continued to grow during the pandemic years, and we can take it forward with added vigor now that we are entering into a normalized situation. So RBI has been a user of NSO data releases, and we keep on engaging in mutual discussions on numerous issues, including data innovations. Thank you for giving us this platform to present our recent work on real-time monitoring of the Indian economy, which got published in the August print of the RBI Bulletin. Real-time monitoring through weekly indices of economic activity is our latest addition to the nowcasting tools which are at the disposal of the Reserve Bank. So this is the outline of our presentation. First, I will run you through the existing nowcasting and forecasting tools which are currently in use at the Central Bank of India. Then the need for using daily and weekly indicators, that will be highlighted. We also draw from the experience of other central banks and research agencies. Following this, we will take you into the variable selection and construction of the weekly index and its performance. Now, within RBI, for monetary policy decision making, there is one interdepartmental group comprising of dedicated divisions in each of the three departments, major departments, which is Department of Economic and Policy Research, DEPR, Department of Statistics and Information Management, DSIM, and Monetary Policy Department, MPD. They play a crucial role in arriving at the projections of GDP growth and inflation rate. For deriving the growth projections, each of these departments individually track the real sector and provide their assessment of economic activity in India before every monetary policy. which you all know is being announced on a bi-monthly basis. The quarterly as well as annual growth projections are revisited during each monetary policy cycle with the help of multiple forecasting and nowcasting techniques, which rely on high frequency indicators, mostly on a monthly frequency. Different approaches are applied to these monthly or quarterly indicators to arrive at an estimate of GDP. Our essential method for nowcasting projection of GDP in DEPR is the benchmark indicator approach, which is based on the methodology outlined in the NSO quarterly GDP projection document. This exercise is different from other nowcasting exercises in that it adopts a disaggregated approach starting from the supply side, as more direct mapping of indicators is possible sector-wise. The latest NAS based shares is applied on the growth rate of indicators to estimate the growth in respective GVA sectors, aggregating up to estimate the total GVA of the economy. The same is then accordingly allocated to the demand side to arrive at the estimate of the GDP. Apart from the benchmark indicator approach, each of the IDG members, they use a battery of sophisticated models of nowcasting the GDP using limited set of indicators by applying a careful selection criteria, dimension reduction techniques, and dynamic factor modeling, also machine learning based models. Using a combination of various estimates and based on their judgment, each of the individual departments, they finalize their projection, which is combined using the root mean square error. This is the number which is used for the monetary policy statement of the governor. Next. Yes, sir. Sarima is also there.
What is it full?
Seasonally adjusted ARIMA, just auto regression models. So apart from the IDG process, we have 3 additional alternate models. So these nowcasting results are also being monitored on a routine basis, and they are also being published. The first one is the 15 indicator dynamic factor model, where the indicators are carefully selected using techniques such as dynamic correlation, turning point correlation, lasso, etc. The second model is based on machine learning techniques of random forest. Both these models are presented by the Strategic Research Unit of DEPR. Another nowcast model based on 27 monthly indicators is regularly published in the State of the Economy article in the Reserve Bank of India Bulletin as the Economic Activity Index, providing separate nowcast for the industrial and services sector. So, with COVID, the use of and monitoring of high frequency indicators has increased. So the above mentioned sophisticated models that we just talked about have been made possible with the rapid digitization and strengthening of data compilation and dissemination machinery in the economy. We are literally witnessing an explosion of data, and currently there are about 100 variables which we are tracking in our division on a regular basis to see the performance of different components of the real sector. Here in this slide we have listed out a few variables which are used to track different subsectors from both the demand and supply side of the economy. Majority of these indicators are also used by NSO in their estimation of quarterly GDP. So in a way we also think that the NSO quarterly estimates are a type of nowcast only, because the benchmark indicator approach has so data is very thin. So there also we are nowcasting. Now coming to the weekly index. So far, whatever models we have explained, they are all using monthly data. So the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic called for prompt actions to safeguard livelihoods and make timely assessment of the economy to help in speedy recovery. Now, also to track the recovery, we started looking at whatever data was coming in the public domain. With faster innovation and realignment of production processes due to pandemic, the extant economic indicators fell short of keeping pace with the rapid changes. So we started supplementing our analysis with additional data, preferably with a lower time lag, say weekly or daily basis. The 13-week moving average of weekly economic index offers an approximation of the 4-quarter annual real GDP growth rate for a hypothetical quarter ending in a given week. Now, Ishu will take you forward through our presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. As you may be aware that for central banks, timely information on economic activity is crucial for exercising a precise judgment. Apart from the reasons mentioned so far, there exists an additional need for the weekly indices given the existing setup of the monetary policy in India, which happens on a bi-monthly basis at the beginning of the respective month. This makes the available information set for decision making highly asynchronous in each policy round. For instance, the GDP data is available quarterly, and the conventional high frequency indicators are available at best on a monthly basis with a lag of 1 to 2 months. Particularly during the August and February rounds of the policy, the information gap is especially large, as the latest available GDP data would lag by 2 quarters. Moreover, the HFI set of the preceding quarter is also not fully complete, with no information available for the reference quarter. So this information gap during the monetary policy rounds can be potentially bridged by the weekly indices, which can be constructed based on the daily or weekly indicators which are available almost near real time. So central banks, think tanks and other independent researchers, they engaged themselves in creating indices to nowcast or forecast the economic activity with the available HFIs even before the pandemic. However, in the wake of abrupt economic developments during the pandemic, the search for an appropriate index intensified. In the US, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York developed a weekly economic index with 10 high-frequency indicators. This index is updated every Thursday with data till the preceding week and primarily gives a weekly picture of the real activity based at a fixed vintage, which is also tested to nowcast the quarterly GDP growth. An unconventional weekly index for Germany is created by the Deutsche Bundesbank, which used high-frequency variables to track the quarterly GDP. It used a mixed frequency dataset comprising of high-frequency variables along with monthly industrial output and latest GDP estimate. Principal component analysis is used to extract the common factor with the mixed frequency within the mixed frequency dataset. The index is viewed as a rolling 13-week growth rate, and at the end of a given quarter, the value of the index can be interpreted as a quarter-on-quarter rate of change. So to track the economic activity of the Eurozone, the ING Bank also constructed the ING Weekly Economic Activity Index. This index is based on the data from 5 largest European economies, namely France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Spain, comprising almost 83% of the Eurozone output. OECD also engaged in real-time tracking of economic activity of 46 countries, including India, through a series of 3 weekly trackers. Now, among the 2 active trackers, one provides the estimate of weekly GDP relative to the same week in the previous year, and the second one provides an estimate of the weekly GDP relative to the same week 2 years before. That is a gap of 104 week. So these trackers are broadly computed by applying machine learning techniques to a panel of Google Trends data and by aggregating together the information on search behavior. So now talking about the Indian experience, both public and private stakeholders, they also monitored the HFIs during the pandemic to track the course of economic activity under the emergency policy actions taken to contain the spread of pandemic. To name a few, the Narrow Recovery Index by Citibank, Business Activity Index by the State Bank of India, the Deutsche Bank India Economic and Mobility Recovery Index, and the Nomura India Business Redemption Index. They became popularly discussed during the pandemic. Taking the February 2020 level as 100, the NIBRI by Nomura, it showed the activity status using Google's daily community data on mobility around the workplace and retail and recreation spots, Apple Maps Index for driving mobility, weekly surveys on labor participation rate, and seasonally adjusted trends in weekly electricity demand. Owing to the lockdown-induced restrictions, it was found that the NIBRI, as per the NIBRI, the activity dropped around 56 percentage points to a low of 44 by the end of April 2020. The table here, it gives a picture of the complete set of indicators with their sources and frequency, which were available publicly, which we explored and used in the construction of our indices. The indicators are broadly categorized into 5 buckets, namely the soft indicators comprising of the Google Trends data and the CMI sentiment indices, the labor market indicators comprising of the unemployment and labor force participation rate, the demand indicators comprising of electricity generation, air cargo, rail freight, motor vehicle registration, and the mobility indicators including the rail and air passenger movement, and the payment indicators. Using the indicators shown in the previous slide, we initiated the process of real-time tracking of the Indian economy by constructing 2 weekly indices. The first one is a 7-indicator weekly activity index using dynamic factor model. It reflects the changes in the economic activity on an year-on-year basis. And the second one is the 15-indicator weekly diffusion index, reflecting the directional movement on a sequential basis, which complements the model-based weekly activity index. The table on the right shows the list of daily or weekly indicators which are included in each of the 2 models. Since many indicators are available for short duration, the indices have been constructed using 2 sets of indicators. The smaller set, which are available for a longer period, are used in the dynamic factor model based weekly activity index for presenting changes on year-on-year basis. And they also provide an opportunity to examine its conformity with the quarterly GDP. So in this and the next 2 slides, we'll look at the trend of individual indicators which are used in the index creation. The soft indicators, namely Google Trends and the CMI sentiment indices, they showed a sharp dip during the first lockdown. The sentiment indices particularly took a huge hit by around 60 index points. Looking at the labor market, though no long-term trend is visible in the unemployment rate, apart from the short-lived spikes during the first and second waves, the labor participation has gradually declined in the recent past. In the transport sector, passenger bookings and freight movement of the Indian Railways also suffered sharp decline on account of the pandemic and related uncertainty. Freight movement, however, registered a swift recovery. Vehicle registration and electricity generation are 2 important indicators of consumption demand. While the former tends to peak near the festive season each year, electricity generation, in addition to the upward trend over the past years, rises during every summer to meet the higher seasonal demand. Payments data represent an unconventional source of tracing the underlying economic activity, given their crucial role in undertaking and settling transactions in a market economy. RTGS transactions, both customer and interbank, which have been exhibiting an upward trend facilitated by the increasing digitization, shows a seasonal peak at the end of every fiscal year. Retail payments data, which RBI began publishing since June 2020, also exhibit similar upward trend. With majority of payments being made around the end of a month, a jump is visible in both value and volume of retail payments every month end. Despite suffering a blow during the pandemic, both the data series, they have recovered well. Cash withdrawal from the ATMs, they recovered after having suffered a dent in Q1 21-22. Data on air cargo, aircraft movement and airport footfall are available on a daily basis only since June 2021. Since the period is too short to be considered for the dynamic factor model, these data series have been used only in the diffusion index. With more data points collected in due course, this air traffic data can probably be utilized in the DFM as well. Now, I would request Chaitali to take over from here and cover the crucial aspects of methodology of the weekly indices.
So thank you, Anupam Madam and Ishu. So I'm going to take you through the final part of the presentation, which discusses the methodology for developing our weekly indices and also the dynamics of the indices vis-a-vis the important macroeconomic indicators. So as presented in the earlier slides, so we have started with a broader set of all available weekly indicators. However, to narrow down the correlation coefficient between the growth rates of the indicators with the year-on-year growth in real GDP and the IIP growth have been examined prior to their inclusion in the model. The indicators included in the model exhibited strong correlation with the target variable along with the expected signs. The magnitude of correlation is particularly strong in case of RTGS payment, electricity generation, Google Trends and vehicle registration. Moving next to the methodology for construction of our weekly indices. So out of our 2 weekly indices, the 7 indicator weekly activity index is developed using the dynamic factor model in a state space framework. So we have used the expectation maximization algorithm, which is a standard algorithm used in such exercise which involves extracting common trends from a larger set of indicators. The state space representation of the factor structure is shown in the slide. So where the x variable is the x is represent the input vectors, which is constitutive of the 7 high frequency indicator considered in our model. F is the vector of common factor, while the lambda represent the factor loadings on our common trends. The second equation represents the vast structure of the unobserved factor of the common trends, which follow a vector auto-regression process of order P. In EM algorithm, the common trend, the FT, is extrapolated using the Kalman filter approach. After estimating the common trend using the Kalman filter, next we rescale it to an interpretable unit, which in our case is quarterly GDP growth. So the scale and the shift parameter are estimated using the following regression equation, where GDPQ is the year-on-year growth in real GDP and the weekly activity index Q is the growth rate of weekly common trend that we have derived using the Kalman filter. The weekly common trend is rescaled based on the estimated coefficient alpha and beta from the above equation. Importantly, the value of the 13-week moving average of the weekly activity index scaled to GDP at the last week of the reference quarter encompasses the activity during the entire quarter and hence is also provide a rough now cost of GDP growth for that quarter. The other weekly indicator that we have that we mentioned earlier is the diffusion index. The weekly diffusion index presents the sequential movement in activity to present an overall picture on the direction of economic activity. While the 7 indicator weekly activity index represent the year-on-year change, the diffusion index shows week-over-week change, or in other words, the momentum in activity on a weekly basis. Next, now we present the dynamics of the index starting from the pandemic period. So the impact of the fast wave of the COVID-induced lockdown is evident from the deep downturn in the trajectory of the weekly activity index. The milder impact of the second wave, which is estimated to be around 1/3 of the loss of GDP during the fast period, is also corroborated by the decline in our activity index level. Further, following the trend of quarterly GDP growth, our activity index, after 2 quarters of contraction, rebound to positive territory in the 3rd quarter of 2020 and further strengthened in the 4th quarter of 2020-21. To address the issue of base effect during the COVID period, a weekly recovery index is also constructed, which is simply the weekly activity index but at level, while the other index is in growth rate form. This is in actual level terms. So this is curated specifically for the economic impact of different waves of pandemic vis-a-vis the pre-pandemic level. This is presented in the bottom panel of the slide. So as you can see from the chart that the economic impact of the second wave was moderate compared to the first wave. Further, the disruption caused by the coal crisis that followed the second wave, the semiconductor chip shortage across the globe, which started impinging on activity, as was reflected in the downward trajectory in the recovery curve since the late October and November 2021. Unlike the first 2 waves of COVID-19, the Omicron wave did not have any significant adverse impact on economic activity, as reflected in the weekly recovery index, which remained above the pre-pandemic level in December and January 2022 and rebounded swiftly thereafter. Next, so after the construction of the index, the next step is to validate its utility as a lead indicator of some important or already existing macroeconomic indicators such as GDP or IIP. So the predictive relationship between the weekly activity index and the 2 primary macro indicators of output such as real GDP and industrial production are also explored. The quarterly average of the weekly activity index together with the year-on-year growth rate of real GDP exhibits strong co-movement over time. The correlation coefficient between the 2 series stood high at 0.64. The 2-month lag in the release of official GDP data makes it even crucial to look at the timely developments in the weekly activity index. In the right panel, the monthly average of weekly activity index tracks the year-on-year growth in IIP reasonably well, with a correlation coefficient between the 2 series at 0.61. The IIP for a particular month releases with a lag of 45 days. Therefore, the 4-week average of the weekly activity index, which represent a month, on the other hand, become available within the 5 days since the end of the month. So, taking you from this slide, we'll move to the next. So, the most crucial application of the weekly activity index, therefore, is nowcasting of quarterly GDP and the monthly IIP. So, we attempt to nowcast the target variable GDP by regressing the flow of information from the weekly activity index, starting with the weekly activity index for just the first month of the quarter and proceeds sequentially as the data available for the subsequent months. For quarterly GDP, the weekly activity index for all the 3 months is highly significant. However, the first month presents the strongest relationship with the highest value of adjusted R square, which decreases slightly but remains significant in the next 2 months. In case of IIP, the information from the first 2 weeks again produce the strongest relationship, while the information from the 3rd and 4th weeks, despite remaining highly significant, did not improve the prediction further. Moreover, we found that the tail index stood less than 1 in case of both IIP and GDP, indicating that the weekly activity index hold better prediction power over the any naive forecast. Moving to our other weekly index, which is the diffusion index. So this sequential movement evident from the weekly diffusion index suggests continuous sluggishness in momentum since March 2022. The 3 months moving average of the weekly diffusion index averaged at 61.1 for the months of February and March 2022, but moderated substantially thereafter amidst the multiple headwinds arising from ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Out of 17 weeks from the first week of April to the week ending on July 24, the weekly diffusion index remained below the 50 on 9 occasions. After touching 50 in May, the 3-month moving average of weekly diffusion index deteriorated to 46.1 in June and further declined to 44.9 in July 2022. So based on the above discussion, we may now conclude that the weekly activity index and weekly diffusion index could serve as composite indicators of overall economic activity and supplement the more sophisticated nowcasting models which is based on even higher number of monthly high frequency indicators. Weekly activity index tracks the ebbs and flows in economic activity during the pandemic years and the Russia-Ukraine war since February 2022. The weekly indices can potentially breach the information gap in the monthly high frequency indicators, which are particularly useful for monetary policy decisions. The 4-week moving average and the 13-week moving average of weekly activity index provide the nowcast of IIP and GDP growth immediately after the end of the reference month or the quarter. The weekly diffusion index for a week present the momentum in activity in terms of a single value on a weekly basis. Going forward, with the availability of sufficient data points, robust statistical and machine learning techniques can be used for enabling and strengthening the real activity tracking even in a more regular and in a more sophisticated manner. So with this I conclude the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, Ms. Bhaumik and Mr. Thakur for your presentation. So we are now ready to take questions from the audience.
Praveen, it's your floor.
Thank you, Anupam, and your team. You've done exceptional work. In fact, the last line you have on the slide was part of the vision document of MOSPI. So it's great that you're doing this work. Anyway, the question that I want to ask you is that how long did it take for you to stabilize the indicators for being used in the econometric modeling? Number one. Number two is that are the coefficients self-adjusting over time? Like, I mean, at times you'd find that the correlation is not very high as you correlate with the macroeconomic release by NSO. Do these coefficients get self-adjusted or do you apply a correction factor? Thirdly, you've shifted from annual to quarterly to monthly to weekly, and we're not talking about daily or hourly. But if you were to break down the data, is it possible at a lesser frequency level to do disaggregated data at the state level or lower? I mean, how granular can you go without compromising the quality of the estimates? And secondly, in the sources of data, what are the challenges that you face to get the data on that frequency that you need for the model? Where did you have to buy it, or was it available publicly?
So we have gone mostly for the publicly available sources, and we also have subscription to CIC database, so that helps.
CMI?
No, CIC.
Both
CMI also, yeah.
Yeah.
So those databases come very handy, they are useful. Yeah. And state level, since the state level data itself is very backdated and we have not attempted at all. But whenever we give inputs for our local board meetings and all, we do now include one table giving the available high frequency data for the concerned states. So that is what we do to, just make our top management visualize that how this state is moving forward. But for the technical analysis, we have not done at the disaggregated level. And your first question was, stabilize. Yeah, we start actually. I was quite fascinated by you know the alerts that I used to receive from Liberty Street alerts. So those weekly. So I had a very young and dynamic team joining me. So I just gave them this idea that why don't we try. So it took some time for us to, you know, get our hands on the weekly and daily indicators which could be used. And internally we started, you know, just observing how this model is behaving before presenting it to our superiors. So when we were slightly confident of, you know, the nowcast that this model was throwing, then now for the past 3 monetary policy cycles, we have presented it to the governor and the MPC members.
After the MPC meeting, can you make this data public?
So we have published it in one of the RBI bulletins. Yeah, regularly. That is what we aspire to. Just like US Fed is releasing every week on every Thursday. So I would like to, but that will of course depend on the, you know, depend on the approval of my bosses. So that I have to first convince them that yes, this can go in the public domain.
Thank you. Outstanding work.
Thank you, sir.
Can I raise a question, please? I am Subbarao here.
Subbarao ji, boliye. Yes, yes.
First of all, my compliments to the Reserve Bank staff for bringing out a wonderful paper on this subject. The nowcasting exercise is being done by the Reserve Bank for the last 3 or 4 years. As a matter of fact, the nowcasting, there is a paper on nowcasting for one of the conferences of the IARNW. Now, the recent innovation is, I think it is a switch over from the monthly data to the weekly data, and then the nowcasting has been done. When I see the last results between the quarterly, between the monthly data and the nowcasting using the quarterly data and the nowcasting using the weekly data, I find the standard errors are higher in the case of the weekly data when compared to the monthly data, and also the correlation coefficients are very low in the case of the weekly data when compared to the monthly data. Now, is it because the quality of data in the case of the weekly series is somewhat weak compared to the monthly data, or is there any other reason for that? The second thing is how this, there are several indicators that have been used. How this have been used as a composite index for explaining this total variation. Thank you.
Sir, one reason for, you know, the poor performance of the weekly could be because these are very short-term availability. You know, we are also hoping that with time the performance of the indicator will improve. And Chaitali, will you like to add?
Yes, so precisely that is one of the reason for this, for some of the variable actually have weak correlation with GDP. So this is maybe because of the short time series. So we don't have enough data points to do a statistically significant correlation. So our data basically starts from 2017 weekly series. So even if it's weekly, but still in terms of number it's not very sufficient, so the stability still remained issue, so which we hope that with availability of more and more data points it will stabilize. So as of now, at least the indicators which showed sufficiently strong correlation, we have included that. There are a few very promising indicator, actually specifically the airport traffic, which at monthly level shows very high correlation with GDP. So that data is available only from 2020. So we are looking forward that data to develop as a longer time series. So that we would like to include going forward. And so, yeah, precisely, I think the size of the data is limiting the robustness of the statistical robustness of the exercise to some extent, but we expect that to stabilize going forward.
And for every policy round, we run both the monthly dynamic factor model and this weekly indicator, and we get different numbers. So
Yes.
we have to take a judgment why this is diverging, and then we take a call.
Yes.
So, but there is generally a trend that
Yes, so the now cost that we have derived out of this weekly indicator for past 3-4 quarters, it's quite accurate of the NOC number. So that's what we feel confident to release it publicly. So the now cost actually was, I think it's not worse than the monthly now costing that we have. So that gives us the confidence to release going ahead with this.
I just have a query, whether the number of indicators remain the same or they can also vary from quarter to quarter.
for as of now we have kept it the same. So
It will expand, sir. Over time, as more indicators become available with the data points, the set may expand, and also we're going to examine the correlation over time. So if it is found that some variables are no longer very significant or contributing significantly, that may be dropped over time. But as of now, since it's a very recent exercise, as of now the set is fixed.
Okay, I just have a small point. When you are showing the graphs, comparing the two, I found that for the GDP, it was quite close, kind of, thing which was going. But for the IIP, lot of differences. It is the IIP might be showing the negative, and your index is showing the positive, and those high and ups. That was only for that particular graph, or it has always been the trend?
So actually, IIP is our major, the interest lies in basically GDP, but since IIP is also a crucial tracker or a crucial indicator for quarterly GDP, we thought we will track, but the relationship between GDP and IIC itself is not very stable.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the variation come from that also. Even if it can explain the GDP quite well, it may not explain the IIP. So
And another point was that for the railways, of course, you have taken the kind of comparison, but there are some other services for which the information is available that has been not found usable, or there was some other point. And as far as the banking service is concerned, separately, did you do that, or your banking service was always like the indicator, but that's based on totally on the data?
So banking services, you mean the payments data?
No.
So, but that is available on monthly basis. That is not a
No.
monthly variable.
I mean, this exercise is outside the scope of this exercise.
Yes, sir. Because that's not a weekly data. It's only the payment data are now daily now, so we included that.
I find some hands raised. I can identify Professor Sethi, one, and there are two more I can't read from here. So, Katyal sir. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so can I request Mr. Katyal to speak? Katyal sahab.
This weekly activity index which they are using, how exactly the agriculture activity has been taken into account? Because the major part of that is unorganized, no data available even at the monthly level or the quarterly level. How exactly the weekly part is covered?
Food arrivals maybe one, I think.
Sir, we don't have unorganized or agriculture included here. We have a separate exercise within our unit which targets unorganized sector. So that we will be presenting internally.
You are forecasting the total GDP. So every activity has to be accounted. So you can't say that you are not accounting the unorganized part of it.
Actually, sir, although directly cannot capture the agriculture because there is no indicator, the direct indicator, but we have included the payments data like the Aadhaar based payment system, which is mostly used in the rural areas which covers a large in proportion of agricultural activities. So indirectly, there are some indexes that may be capturing the agriculture or unorganized activity also. But yes, as of now, we don't have any direct indicators.
Professor Sethi. Professor Sethi, you have the floor. Are you able to listen? Am I audible? I think he is not able to listen. Is there any way to give him the floor by our technical people? No?
Rajiv Mehta sir too.
Rajiv Mehta. No, Rajiv Sharma or Rajiv Mehta?
Rajiv Mehta sir.
It is Rajiv Mehta, I saw. Yeah, Rajiv Mehta. Where is Mehta?
Then Katyal sahab sir.
Katyal ho gaya. Professor Sethi is not able to listen. Professor Sethi?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I must congratulate the team for a wonderful presentation. However, I have one point of clarification to be sought. Ma'am, in one of the slides, activity data has been shown with effect from December 18 to March 22. And I think for the purpose of forecasting, we have made use of certain time series analytical techniques, including that. And during the mid of 20, there has been a rapid dip in the activity. And it's very likely that there is a structural break at that point of time. But in the presentation, we haven't made any mention whether any examination of the structural break was made or not. And if there indeed is a structural break, then the forecasting technique, may become invalid. So could you kindly, clarify on this issue?
Yes, sir. Yes, also data on growth terms, it started from 2018 and there is a pandemic break in April 2020. But sir, to call it a structural break, we're not sure whether it's a structural break because there is a dip and then there is a V-shaped recovery coming back to the level. So for structural break, there should be a permanent main shift. So probably we have not witnessed that. So it's just a break and then coming back to that level. So that's why we have not checked for structural break. But yes, so we have used some dummy variables for correcting for this drop, like the sharp drop in April 2020 and the base effect induced very high growth in 2021. For those two periods, we have included two dummy variables. So that's how we corrected for those outliers. We did correct it for the outliers, but we're not sure whether these are structural break. Also, to test for structural break statistically, I think we need more data points after. So as of now, we don't have that many data points also, but maybe going forward, we can test for structural break as well.
But in that case, you see, our results might be at some doubt if we haven't examined that. Anyways, we can always try.
We'll try, sir, for structural break. Maybe with some more data points, we'll see whether there is actual permanent main shift with COVID, or there is just a break and then coming back to the normal. So,
okay, Professor Shetty, you want to say something more?
Thank you very much. Please.
Rajiv Mehta. Rajiv Mehta. No, I'm not sure whether the voice is reaching. Professor Shetty is showing finger.
Hello.
Asa, is it talking? Okay, Professor Shetty.
Are you able to hear me?
Rajiv. Who is speaking?
Hello.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
First of all, my compliments from Saudi Arabia, and it's a pleasure to be spending my weekend. Today is a Friday. I'm enjoying my weekend with a very fruitful talk. And interestingly, because in the digitalization, what is required is an innovation, and this innovation is evidently presented in this beautiful presentation. It is very innovative. I have got 2 or 3 observations. Like some of the indicators which have been used there, especially I was watching this annual time lag and weekly moving average. Some of these indicators, they follow a time lag. So I hope that when we are bunching these indicators, we are possibly also taking note that this time lag is also adjusted. Second point I have got that when we are depending on the indicators coming from the other sources, what is a guarantee of their transparency? Because they may, what happens, I'm handling many indicators coming from all different kind of sources, and they are making the changes in the composition of the indicator. So when such change in the composition of the indicator going in our analysis, the overall, so we have to be little guarded on that. So these are 2 points. And of course, third point is hopefully in the composite indicators, you must be giving some kind of a normalization and equal weight assignment. So that's a normal practice you will be making. But again, some of these observations and my compliments to the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yep. Dr. Shetty. Dr. Shetty. Dr. Shetty. No, you are, I have to unmute? No, he has to unmute. But how do I convey? Dr. Shetty, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself? Dr. Shetty, can you please unmute yourself?
Now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Is that okay?
Yes. Okay.
Yes, frankly, I had read an article earlier in the RBI bulletin in August. When I went through, at that time I collected a few thoughts. I thought I should share it with them. I was extremely impressed with the work they had done. I was a part of the same desk, same Reserve Bank department, and the work that is being done now is far superior, far more rigorous. There is no doubt about it.
Good.
But I want to make one general observation on the broad theme of the study. It is to now cast GDP. Many governors earlier raised doubts on the reliability of GDP growth rates for policy making. There have been controversies on that. Now, the nowcasting team is to forecast the same unreliable GDP. There are,
how do you know?
particularly some of us who have worked on GDP issues, have some doubts. And the doubt there is essentially of doubt is inability to capture the agriculture sector, particularly the unorganized sector. And in this work that they are doing, the rainfall data, the organized sector and the unorganized sector are neglected. And yet you have a nowcasting which gives you reasonably good correlation with the GDP. So therefore, a simple question that arises in my mind is that what are we doing? Are we, with the nowcasting, proceeding on the same lines as what the GDP growth tells us? That is the question before us. But otherwise, I am saying the general question, nothing serious. I leave it to the authors to look at it carefully. And again I say, that is an excellent work, very rigorous, extremely impressive. And I thought I'll just make this observation, which it did occur to me when I read that article in the August bulletin.
Thank you very much for your words for encouragement. Do you want to respond? I think he's saying good.
Yes, sir. We are thriving to, we are also learners. We are also beginners. So it's in that spirit, and your words are really encouraging. And I will request all the audience members, online, offline, you can send your written comments also, whatever you want to. We'll definitely like to. This is just a work at the inception stage. We will like to improve it further. Thank you.
Okay. Have we any more points? Otherwise, we can move. So, thank you very much. You can move to the.
Thank you, everyone. Now I would like to invite Professor Sabyasachi Kar to join the dignitaries on the dais.
First, you have to go through the channel.
May I now request Ms. Priyanka Pant, Deputy Director, National Accounts Division, to present a bouquet to Professor Kar. Moving on to the third and the last presentation of this seminar. So our next speaker is Professor Sabyasachi Kar, who will be speaking on the topic using regional data to analyze the growth and convergence in Indian economy.
How will I use the computer?
So actually, you can navigate it from here, or they can do it for you.
No, I'll do it myself.
So may I introduce you to the audience?
Yeah, I see.
Okay. So Professor Kar is currently serving as RBI Chair Professor in Institute of Economic Growth as well as National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. He also holds the position of Honorary Senior Research Fellow at University of Manchester, United Kingdom. In addition to this, he is a research partner with Global Poverty and Inequality Dynamics Research Network, King's College, United Kingdom. Sir has also been a part of various research programs and undertaken several projects sponsored by Government of India, World Bank, etc. He is a distinguished researcher with over 30 published papers. He has presented papers at various international and national seminars and delivered lectures at several educational institutions. With this brief introduction, I now invite Professor Kar to present his paper. So.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. I am from the Institute of Economic Growth, as you have come to know, but my, let me call it, connection with your organization goes back more than a decade, although I have not been in touch for some time. My co-author and senior colleague, Professor Bhattacharya, was very closely associated with the organization for a long time.
He was president.
Yes. And I remember going to one of the conferences in Jaipur. By the way, can you all hear me? Yeah. Jaipur, which was extremely interesting. We usually go to conferences where we talk about economics, but to talk about data and the problems and prospects of that is very useful. Although, in fact, we stand to learn more from all of your work than actually, being able to share more knowledge on this. When Sri Rajiv Kumar approached me, my first reaction was, I would really like to sit here and listen to all of you. I don't know what exactly I have to share with you, but he explained that you are also interested in what your data is doing in the real world. So let me try and share some of this. I'm afraid it will be a little more economics than the last presentation.
Welcome.
And but by the way, let me start by congratulating that. I had been a forecaster for a long time. With the Planning Commission, we had a very big macro model which we used to forecast. Excellent work done. I had a question, but then I thought maybe I'll first make my presentation so that. So regional data, we all know it's a problem in India. The quality of regional data is not good. But as increasingly we understand, everything that's happening in India is more importantly in the regions than at the national level. We are going down. We've been trying to study states for quite some time, but increasingly policymakers are also interested in even districts and lower levels of disaggregation. So we have to try and get data accumulation, data quality at the regional level better. And one of the ways I think we can do that is by constantly presenting what we are doing with the current data, showing how good or bad those results are, and then using all of that to try and solve the problem of regional data. The issue of growth and convergence has been there in India. It's been studied for about now 2 to 3 decades. I'm sure all of you are aware of it, but just in case some of you do not know of it, can I get after 40 or 50 minutes, if you can tell me that I've used up my time.
Okay.
So if we think of the distribution of all the regional incomes, and here you see the red and the blue line, and suppose those are the 2 extremes of the distribution. So it's important from the the policy point of view to know what is happening over time to this distribution, and standard theories of economic growth tells us that there should be convergence, which is given in panel A here, which is that over time areas that are less developed should be catching up with areas that are more developed, and so that the dispersion should be going down over time. This is what is called convergence, and this has been seen in many areas. If you look at the regions of the US or you look at the regions of Japan, they show this kinds of trends over time. But what many studies have shown in India is, in fact, particularly after the reforms post 90s, it seems that the opposite has been happening. And so if you look at panel B here, that's what we call divergence, and that's kind of what is happening in India. The poorer states are not being able to catch up with some of the richer ones, and so the dispersion is going up over time. So this has been more or less established, kind of a consensus, but then some people started pointing out that that's not sufficiently useful to think of when you think of regional growth, because while the overall dispersion may be moving in a certain way, what is happening within the distribution is also very important. And so if you look at panel C here, what you see is that over time what is happening is that regional, if you think in terms of GDP, state GDP, then there are clusters forming over time rather than states all going in every different way. And so if clusters form, then what we characterize that as convergence clubs instead of either convergence or divergence. So where each of these cluster you can think of as a club, and then that's very useful in terms of thinking about policy, because once you have clubs, then you know that there are common characteristics of certain regions. You don't have to have 30 policies, different policies for 30 states. You can think of them in terms of certain clubs and have common kind of approaches to these clubs. So the question then is, in India, what is really happening? Is it actually only divergence happening, or can we think of that in terms of convergence clubs? So this is one of the studies that I'm doing currently together with the World Bank. The other way. So the research questions here are basically, what is the trend in regional convergence in India? Is there actual evidence of club formation? Once we look at that, we can also think of, going over to policies. So if there are such clubs, what are the strong correlates of club formation? So if there are some rich clubs and some poor clubs, what are the correlates of richer clubs, what are the correlates of poorer clubs. So that's the natural way to think of it when you think of policy. And then the final question is that, if you can find out some of these correlates, how do you think of moving from that to actual policy interpretation and on the ground policy implications? So to do this, we use two different kinds of data. The first one is very standard data that has been used for a long time, which is the GSDP data. I'm sure some of you may be involved in producing this data, but be that as it may, we take this data and we try to create time series of states and union territories for this data over time. So basically, one of the problems that we face is, of course, that there are different base years, and so we have to put that all together, we have to splice it. These are pretty standard ways of doing. All of you, I'm sure, are aware of how data is spliced and put together in the form of one continuous series. But let me point out one problem that we faced, and I think it's important to think about why these things are happening. As all of you may be aware, that when we have these overlapping data with different year bases, there are some common years that we have, and based on those common years we find out multipliers, and then we use those multipliers to calculate the data backward. Now if you have more than 1 year, maybe 3 or 4 years data, then you'd expect the multipliers to be, it won't obviously be exactly the same, but to lie around a certain range of values. But we found that some of these multipliers are absolutely outliers. If there are 4 values, one of them is completely out of whack with the rest. So it's an important question, why, if we are creating these databases based on different annual basis, why should the multipliers not be tightly within a certain range? So what we do is, in order to avoid this problem of outliers in the multipliers, instead of taking what is the standard process, which is to take the average of all the multipliers, we take their median, because median is known as a measure which actually is able to avoid outliers. So instead of taking the mean, you take the median of the multipliers, and then that's how we have created a standard data series for 31 states for a significant period. I think it starts from 70s right up to 2018-19. We stopped just before COVID, so that any kind of COVID related error does not creep into the analysis. This is proving to be a problem, because okay, but I have to also see it. Maybe I'll just stand there and speak, if that's not a problem. Is that
you can take you can sit and use this mic.
You can sit here and speak.
I'm actually used to standing and speaking.
You can stand. This mic is quite big, so you can even stand here. No.
But I'm sorry.
अब देखिए कॉलर माइक was not audible. ऑनलाइन लोग सुन पा रहे हैं कि नहीं, देखना
चेक कर लीजिए पहले. एक्चुअली वहाँ पे एक लैपटॉप रखने से ना बेस्ट होता है. Do you want to check whether the online people can hear me?
You can just ask them.
Am I audible?
Can you hear me? Those who are online, can you hear me? Any one of you can just confirm?
Yeah, we can hear.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, let's see. So another problem that we faced was that we found that some of the states that have been divided into sub-states, in the particular case of Telangana,
we could not actually get information on how to create a separate back data for that state going back. So the only solution possible for us was to put Telangana and Andhra together and treat that as one unit for the whole period. And then finally we took population values and divided to get per capita values of these time series. So once we have created these, we have used certain techniques that are used for these types of analysis. So the standard test that is used in this framework is called the Phillips and Sewell approach. It's a paper that they published in 2007. I will not go into the mathematics of their proof. I'll just tell you the various steps that are involved, just to give you a feeling of how we actually find out about the clustering or the club formations using the data that we have. So basically it's a broad two-step method. The first step is we first try and see whether there is absolute convergence in the data. You remember the diagram that I showed first, panel A was absolute convergence. And so if if the statistical test rejects absolute convergence, you then have the possibility of two alternative possibilities. One is that there is club convergence or there is absolute divergence. So then in the next step what we do is that we once the test results, if it accepts absolute convergence, then that's the result. And if it doesn't, then we go on to the next step, which is to trying to identify clubs. And so this again it's a bit of a multi-step method. It takes a few members from the top at a time and then tests whether there is convergence within that club. If there is convergence, then they add more members. And they go on till the convergence is rejected. So then once it is rejected, you know that you have one club, and then you again start with the rest of the members, and you go on and on till you have exhausted the whole. For in our case, this is the states that we have. And sometimes what we find is that you might find n number of clubs, but there will also be some members which will not belong to any of the clubs. So those are the members that are actually completely diverging from any of the clubs. You can think of them in fact as single member clubs as well. So you do not need all clubs to have multiple members. So you can have either multiple member club or single member club. And there is this, in the extreme case that you do not find any clubs, then you come to the conclusion that the whole distribution is actually showing complete divergence, which is what was being thought of about the Indian economy in the literature before club convergence as a literature came up. So this is what I have just described, how to do the formation of the clubs. There's also there's a process of merging that is used. So suppose you have found out say 8 clubs to start with, then you also try to see if you can merge some of the clubs together. So whether the first and the second club themselves can be thought of as one single club instead of 2 different clubs. So you do exactly the same process until you finally find what is the number of clubs in your data. So now we go to the part where we use our data that I have described and this technique in order to analyze club formation in the Indian economy. Here are the results of that log T test that I just described. If you look at the columns, the second column tests for absolute convergence. You'll find the T statistic at the bottom of the column. It is -2, -203. Anything, if you look at the note at the bottom of the page, you see anything that is less than -1.65 actually rejects convergence. So what this basically means is that for the Indian states and union territories, there is no proof, statistical proof, that they are all converging over time. So once we have that, we know that it is either club convergence or absolute divergence. So then we go through the process of trying to identify clubs, and what we find is that there are in fact 4 clubs which are multi-member. If you see here, Club 1, Club 2, Club 3, Club 4. And then we have two states which are divergent. They do not belong to any of the clubs. These 2 states are Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. And you notice that the membership, the number of members in the clubs are also different. Club 1, which is actually in the poorest club, has 5 members. Then you have Club 2, which has 9 members, the largest club. Then you have Club 3 with 8 members, and finally the richest club is Club 4. Now, while I say that they are the poorest and richest, you need to understand that it is possible for a relatively less rich member also, a state, to be in one of the richer clubs. A richer clubs means that the growth dynamics of the members tend towards richness. So if some club which was relatively, say, moderately, middle income, but it is having high growth rate, then it can actually become a member of a richer club. So it is not that, we just take a bunch of clubs from the richest and make them into a richer club. The underlying growth dynamics is what determines, in fact, what club each of these will belong to. And in fact, just again mentioning the last presentation, I think the underlying, econometrics there was based on a similar model, because this also uses a factor model. So using a latent factor model, you can find out the underlying dynamics of the members of each of these clubs. Here is a graph of the average per capita income of each of the clubs that we have found. You'll notice that there are 6 of them. That's because there are 4 multi-member clubs and 2 states which are individual clubs. The 4 multi-member clubs are in red, yellow, I'll call that dark maroon, and green, whereas the other 2 clubs are in blue and dark blue again. So one thing that's clear from this, this graph is that as we claimed, these clubs are such that their average incomes do not show any long-term tendency of going towards each other, except a little bit for the last 2, where UP is tending towards the lowest club as well. But otherwise, you'll see that the long-term tendency of each of these clubs is to move away from each other. In other words, you can think of, if some of you may be aware of, low-level income traps that have been there in the literature for a long time. So some of these are like those traps. If you are caught in a low-level club, then you are actually kind of stuck in that club. You are not converging towards a higher club as standard economic theory predicts you should. And so there are reasons for maybe government intervention in those cases, and there are reasons for being worried why they are not catching up. So it is a question. So what this clubs thing shows is that it is not only a question of underdevelopment per se, but also the fact that the long-term dynamics of this are such that the underdevelopment is persistent underdevelopment. So they are going to continue to be in the kind of clubs that they are. There is no tendency for them to catch up with the higher clubs. And here is the representation on a map of India of the same clubs. You'll find that the poorest clubs are the ones that are in light blue. Then there are the dark blue states, which are the second lowest club. The light green ones are the second highest club, and the dark green ones are the highest clubs. So interestingly, what comes out from this diagram is that there seems to be some spatial nature to these clubs as well. You see that in at least the last 3, the lowest club and the clubs after that, the 2, except for the highest club, all 3 clubs seem to show a lot of spatial collinearity, so that clubs that are close to each other are tending towards the same club in the long run. This is again very important from policy point of view, because then you can have spatially targeted policies to help some of these clubs, for example, get some of these states to get out of these clubs if you want to. Next, as I said, once you have identified clubs, these are regional clubs in India, what do you do with them? You try to see what really is determining these clubs. How exactly can we have some kind of leverage over these clubs so that policy can be used to get them out of some of these clubs. So what we have done is again used some regional data. This is actually regional data given to us by the World Bank, but it is collected from standard secondary sources. You'll notice a lot of them are taken from the RBI's Handbook of Statistics of Indian States. Capital expenditure as a ratio to GDP, share of agriculture, then share of industry. Share of agriculture and industry is taken from the CSO, the MOSPI data. You have ease of doing business at the state level, that is taken from the RBI's handbook. Then there is mean years of schooling, which is a human capital data that's provided by something called a global data lab. And you have some employment data for each of these states that we have taken from PLFS for certain years and then used certain growth rates. This actually is the part that has been done by the World Bank. They have provided us with the data, but we are giving you here what is the basic sources of all of this data. So what we do is that we take this data, we have data on the states, and as you remember, we have for each state a membership of a certain club. And we can now use ordered probit regression to try and relate club formation to these variables. So we give in ordered probit you rank the the members. So if you think of each of the states having a particular club membership, you can rank those club memberships. The richest one you can call 1 and the poorest one you can call 4, and so you can use those ordered rankings and then run regressions to relate those rankings to some of these variables that are state level variables, which we have done here. So what we find is that 4 of the variables show, let me call it strong correlation. By now it has been established that you can't find causal relationships based on regression anymore. So we don't claim that these are causal relationships. They are strongly correlated with club formation. So what are these variables? Very interestingly, you have 2 variables which relate to what we call structural transformation. What are those 2 variables? The decrease in the share of agriculture and increase in the share of manufacturing. So we can in a way combine these 2 and call that structural transformation. So states which have higher structural transformation belong to higher clubs. That's the interpretation of this regression exercise. Similarly, we have mean years of schooling, human capital as a significant variable, and also capital expenditure by the the government of each of these states as another variable. So this is the way we use the standard regional data to analyze some of the underlying factors in of growth in this regions.
Ease of doing business fit in?
Yes.
Ease of doing business, where does it, what is the relationship?
So you are looking at the growth dynamics of each of these states, and you have measures of ease of doing business in each of these states. And the idea is that if the ease of doing business is more, it is better. If it is easier to do business in a certain state, then possibility of investment and growth, that's the kind of underlying hypothesis. If we find results that, as we find there is no significance in this set of results, which clearly seems to indicate either that we are not measuring doing business properly, or even if it is measured properly, there may be other factors which do not allow just the business environment to do its work. So one of these 2 reasons could be underlying factors.
This has come as part of that. You are given this variable.
So what happened is,
World Bank thing?
Yeah, so what happened is that when we, in fact, one part of the project was to try and collect as much regional data as possible and put it in a database from existing secondary data. So we have collected a large number of variables, but then when we actually we wanted to run regressions, we found that a lot of them actually measure the same thing. So we took, we used our own understanding of the economy to choose maybe from 3 or 4 variables the most suitable one, and whatever we have received, whatever variables are available, we have put into this regression. So that's the way this has been done. So the second part of what I'm going to present is probably going to be more interesting for many of you because it is something new. We are ourselves students. Ma'am mentioned the word student. I think that's very appropriate for all of us. We are all students of this kind of data and its application, and you will see what I mean when I say that we are students and why it's useful. So we use night lights data, which many of you may be aware of, in order to do the work at a level which is lower than states. We try to go to the level of districts, and so unfortunately there was a district GDP that was available for some time, but now we do not have district GDP anymore. So we have to proxy it with some other variable. We are trying to see whether it can be done at all using night lights data. How I feel about this, I'll come to at the end. But right now, let us keep an open mind about this kind of data and see what it does. So for those who already know about nightlight data, this set of pictures will be self. You can you obviously understand what it is, but just in case there are people who are not aware. Night lights data are basically data that are collected by satellites for all countries, and you can have pictorial representations of that, of the kind that you see here, one for 2012 and the other for 2021. This is what nightlight pictorial representation looks like, but the actual data is numeric, obviously, and I will talk a little bit about what kind of data is available for nightlight. So there are 3 sources of nightlight data that are available till now. The first one is what is called DMSP OLS. This was the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program Operational Line Scan System. This was what was used as nightlight for a very long time. Then there was a version of that DMSP OLS itself, which is called radiance calibrated. I'll explain all of this a little bit in the next slide. The radiance calibrated version of this. And finally, we now have what is called the VIIRS, or the Visible Infrared Imaging Radiometer suite. So what are each of these? I'll just give you a little idea. So DMSP OLS nightlight, they were an annual series constructed from satellite images taken of the Earth at night. So this data is available for the years 1992 to 2013. That is the whole range of that data. Originally, the DMSP OLS, the way they used to measure nightlight was between 0 and 63. That's the way it was defined. Now, basically, it became very popular. I'm sure many of you have seen hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of papers that have been published using night lights data all over the world. It's become a extremely popular data for the obvious reason that getting regional data is very difficult in many countries, particularly developing countries. So this is seen as an easier way of getting some sense of what is happening in these countries. Although this data is controversial, I must say that there are problems, as you will see. I'll show you. But there's still some information content in this data, and so the idea is whether that information content is good enough for us to use it in some way that is useful. So I mentioned the DMSP OLS. Then what happened is once papers started to be published, it was found that this 0 to 63 delineation was a problem, because when you cut off at 63, what happens? 63 would usually be the brightest light areas, and sometimes what was happening is that it was not being able to differentiate between maybe a very bright area and a super bright area, giving both of them 63. So that needed to be corrected. So this radiance calibration was exactly that. So what the radiance calibration did was, instead of having it topped off at 63, you could now have a measure which is proportional to the light, so that it is more useful. The problem was that it was not available for every year. So this was created for a few number of years and provided to researchers. But if you want to use it as a annual data, then you have to interpolate between the periods if you want to use that. So that was one of the shortcomings of this data. And then you had a new satellite based data that came up after 2013, which is the VIIRS. So this has replaced the DMSP OLS, and the VIIRS data has many advantages over DMSP OLS. It has, for one thing, it has much better technology. It is much better resolution, and as a result the time series is more consistent. But because of the better technology, there is also associated problems. So what was found out when people actually started using it is, because it is so good, it is picking up light that is not associated necessarily with economic activity that you want to capture. Sometimes there are forest fires, sometimes there are other reasons why there might be light, and some of it was being picked up, and so error was creeping in. So that is one of the problems of the VIIRS. So what has been done is a lot of correction has been done over time to this VIIRS. Various versions of the VIIRS is now available, taking care of some of these problems. In the Indian context, for example, one major problem is that we have monsoons for a long period, and during monsoons what happens is that the light that is reflected is not necessarily consistent with the underlying economic activity. So some kind of correction needs to be done for that. So these are some of the problems, a priori problems that are there with the nightlight data. So once we had the nightlight data from, we were provided again the nightlight data by the World Bank. Our first approach was to see how good it is, because as I said, we are students, we do not need to take the data as a given, we should try and see how good it is. So what we did is that we aggregated it for states and tried to see how well they correlate with levels of output and growth rates of output. And unfortunately we found that the correlations are not good. Here you have a graph where we have put DMSP OLS and net stock state domestic product. The left one is in level. They seem to be moving in the same direction. There is some correlation between them. So to an extent one can think of them as I said, they provide some amount of information on the underlying economic activity, although there is a lot of error which has to be also explained. Unfortunately, the new version that we have, we found that they give, that the correlation is worse with that, the VIIRS, which is supposed to be a better database. So this is the situation, and so then we were faced with the dilemma of what to do with this data. So what we have done is we already have this analysis going back, whatever I presented, using the CSO data, right? So we thought, let's just replicate it using this data and see whether there is similarity of results between using nightlights data and the CSO data, the GSDP data, whether that makes sense at all. So for that what we have to do is, first we have to estimate convergence clubs using nightlight data. We have used because the DMSP OLS RC version was somewhat better, we have used that data here. Here again, corresponding to the analysis that I presented earlier. Here are the clubs that have been formed. This is for the districts. Remember, this is not for the states. And what we find that there are again club formations within districts. We find 6 clubs. There is no any indication of absolute convergence. So we have 6 club formations in the Indian districts if we use the nightlight data. Here is the representation on the Indian map again. And here is what we find interesting. I told you that we find that the nightlight data is not showing very strong relationship with the JSDP. But if you just look at the the groups here, they seem to make sense. I mean, the smell test, if you can call it a smell test, is passed. You see the red ones are the ones which are the poorest again. We do expect some of those districts to be in some of those, sure, poorer districts. And similarly, the blue ones are the richer ones. We have seen in the earlier thing that it was the South Indian states which have richer clubs. So this is kind of consistent with that. So because there is not much time, what I'll do is show you one more thing which is important for policy. So the idea is that if districts have club convergence instead of absolute convergence, it means that the dynamics of district growth is making them move towards certain districts within those clubs rather than the growth centers of India. So for each club you have what we can call an attractor, some districts that are doing well, and that is driving convergence within that club. So the natural policy suggestion here is that the government needs to focus on some of the star districts within each club, and if you can develop some of the star districts, then all the districts in that club will get advantage of the dynamics of those star districts, and so the overall growth of each of these districts will probably go up. So what we have done is try to identify these star districts in India. So for each club we have identified the star districts by classifying them as the top 10% in terms of nightlight. Here assuming nightlight is proportional to activity in some sense. But we find that again the smell test seems to be we're passing the smell test. So this is for the richest clubs, and the districts are identified on the right hand corner, lower right hand corner. So districts like Rangareddy, Ludhiana, Amritsar, these are the star districts within this club. Similarly, if we go to we have all the 6 clubs, but let me just show you the poor ones directly. So here you have club 6, which is the poorest. So here Sultanpur, Jaunpur, Hardoi, Pratapgarh, these are the star districts within the poorest club. So this is another way in which you can try and identify the spatial growth determinants of regions of India. So with that I'll stop here. I think my objective has been to try and show that the different kinds of data we can use to do analysis at the regional level. There is a high level of error and noise in the data, but in the absence of any other information, they seem to be providing something. The way forward is to correct them and make them more useful, and that is where all of you come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kar. It has been very interesting to listen. Because the time is left is not much, so the best thing is to take the questions if Professor Kar likes to answer them or give them some references.
Sure.
Yeah, I see Dr. Praveen Srivastava. Praveen, you could. Mike. Yes.
I'll just jot down the question.
Thank you, Professor Kar, for illuminating discussion on nightlights. You know, MOSPI had engaged with McKinsey Global Institute for doing a study on that, and somehow it couldn't go forward, COVID and so many other things. But there's one source of data which you really need to see is the economic census data. You have district-wise distribution of industries from 2013, then the last one was 2019. The results, I think, are not out yet. But that shows a growth in terms of the economic activities by entities. So if that could be mapped into, in fact, that's the project that we gave to McKinsey Global Institute, was that if they could use the economic census data for corroborating and correlating with the night lights,
Right.
then that is more ground truthing than a GSDP at a macro level.
Right.
Right. So that's something you can consider, and perhaps request NSO to start sharing the data so that you could do that sort of work. I mean, that would be really interesting to everyone.
Right.
Thank you.
Just a brief comment on that. I think you're very right, because what we find is that nightlight provides better information in the cross-section sense than the time series sense. And so we need to have the information on the over time change from some other source, so that if we can put this together, it will be very useful.
And since the economic census data is available at the district level,
Right.
so your correlation will be better.
Right.
Interesting. Yes. Any more questions from the?
There's a question from me.
Yes, Chaitali.
Thank you, sir, for a very interesting presentation. Especially the concept of club convergence is very new to me. So I just want to think, sir, so in this exercise you have first decided on the club absolute convergence, and then you determine or identify the structural determinants of these clubs. So I was just trying to think how the composition of club will be different if you think in terms of conditional convergence, where you use these control variables in your convergence equation itself, and then you determine the clubs. So
Right. So this is again something I've been thinking about. So what you suggest is basically putting the literature of conditional convergence and this club convergence together. So one possibility is, and this was done in the literature that came before this t-test came up. At that time, the literature was based on the estimation of stochastic kernels, basically non-parametric estimations, where you could identify clubs from basically humps in the distribution. So if there are two modes, basically there's a bimodal kind of clubs. So what used to be done there is you first run the regression, and then you take the part which is controlled for. It's like it's a bit like the IV regression. You control for certain explanatory variable, then you take the rest, and then you see whether. So you start by not controlling, and then you compare that to the controlled thing and see whether the things have changed or not. And if they have, then you can say that these are the factors that is turning a multimodal or multi-club distribution into a single club distribution. So these are factors that are determining. So that might be one way of thinking about what you are suggesting. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Cott. That was an interesting way to look at this data set. I was just wondering that between this club convergence data and the nightlight data, especially district level, don't you have very contradicting findings in respect of Eastern UP districts? It appeared so at the first glance.
No, true. In fact, 3 states, so if you go back to the scatter diagram that we showed, the problem was coming from 3 states. 2 of them had problematic growth rates, and 1 of them have problematic levels. So UP and Bihar are showing very high growth rates in lights, for a period when we think we know that there was no such high growth rate based on GSDP data. And this is something that we are trying to investigate why this is happening. Some people initially say this was because of electrification. But then even electrification was controlled for, there are data that controls for all of this, and yet you are getting that. Sometimes I think that the LED revolution may have spoiled the data, because LED light is very cheap and it's easy. We see in almost many cities the governments are putting up LED light everywhere. I know Calcutta is one city, and now in Delhi also there's LED lights everywhere. So yes, that problem is there. And the other place where we got problem was Kerala. So Kerala is a state which is somewhere in the middle when it comes to GSDP data, middle income in the Indian thing. But in terms of night light, it is a very low night light. Now again, there were explanations which say that there is a lot of forest cover, lights are not coming up. So the question is what we do with it. How do we deal with this?
And not only that, even for many of the metropolis, it was not showing much, but very strangely, northern Bihar and eastern UP was showing a lot of glare as compared to the rest of India in 21.
Yeah, let me share with you a little thing. So I am on Twitter, which is the social media thing. So in the economic survey that came up with that diagram, I was puzzled because the economic survey showed that graph, and I asked if anybody could explain that. And there are some tech savvy people, right? Some people, we are just trying to understand it. There are people who understand this very well. They say that, depending on what luminosity you choose, some things might look brighter. So don't go by, the visual representation. Just go by data. Sometimes visual representation is, it cheats the eye. So there are all kinds of issues. I'm completely in agreement with what you are saying. My point is that if there are some outliers, but does it say something about the overall economy still? Does it have some kind of information? And this is why I was talking about the smell test, because despite knowing that there are problems, some of the results are kind of consistent with our understanding of what is happening. So we need to look more into this, I think.
I don't see any hand here, but I see some hands in our online participants. Is it Shastri? Hello. Can you unmute Dr. Shastri?
Done. Sorry.
Okay.
There was some problem.
Okay. I see. Is it Rajiv Sharma?
Hello?
The upper one? Hello? Yes. Go ahead. You are muted. You have to unmute yourself, then only we can listen.
I think I have done that.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Now it's okay?
Yes, okay, Shatti.
Okay, tell me. What is that I can do?
Yes,
there was a mistake. I was not in touch with you people.
Oh.
Now I'm fine. I'm back.
Okay. This is N. Shastri. Dr. Shastri, you have some question? He is talking to somebody.
I missed the meeting.
Okay.
I'm unable to raise any question.
Yes, okay. Thank you. Dr. Shastri.
No, I think
the photo is something.
No, I think he has some problem because I can see it muted.
Okay.
He has not unmuted himself.
Okay. Yes.
Amarjit Singh Sethi is also saying something.
Amarjit Sethi is raising hands. Amarjit, Dr. Sethi.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Kaur, for this wonderful presentation. Very interesting. But I have a few points of clarification to be sought. Number one, in the approach which you have followed, that is due to Phillips and Soul 2007, it makes use of estimating absolute convergence followed by club convergence. Does it talk of the speed of convergence as, along with that? Number two, through this methodology, we first try to estimate absolute convergence and then try to estimate some, try to identify some sort of clusters among the states, which follow some sort of homogeneity. Will it be different if we first go in for, say, k-means clustering and then estimate the usual type of clustering among those clusters? I hope you get my point. We first go in for clustering, maybe through hierarchical approach or k-means clustering, and then through the clusters of the states thus obtained, we estimate whether some sort of absolute convergence has been realized or not. Then a point which has come to my mind is that I am very happy to find that Amritsar has turned out to be a star district among the certain other districts like Ludhiana, Jamnagar and so on and so forth.
That's your presence.
Yeah, I belong to Amritsar, sir. That's why this point has come to my mind. Ludhiana and Jamnagar, of course, they are industrially very forward type of district, but Amritsar happens to be a laggard district industrially. So, I mean, the nightlight data has made this district to be the star district. Maybe because of the elimination of golden temple.
Yes, yes, that's right.
But economically, I really wonder whether it can occupy that position or not.
Right.
So could you kindly clarify on these issues?
So I'll just start from the end. I'll start from the end.
You see the line below, there is a sign of mic.
Sorry?
What is that?
Near the video, there is a sign of mic. Just that.
So he's helping Shastri.
Yeah, yeah.
His son is helping, but I think not able to
Yeah,
get that.
so...
In the last line below, in the bottom,
Should I answer? Or?
there is a mic sign.
He's talking.
Just touch that.
We must have telephoned him, otherwise how would he know?
Should I answer?
Yeah, yeah, I think you can answer in the meanwhile. He will take time.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I think, you know, the last point that you made is exactly the point that we have been talking about. How do we, you know, there are any measure of any variable has error, and any measure will reflect certain underlying factors, but also other factors that you really don't want to take into account. And it's true that if you go by light, then on an average it might reflect in comparison to darkness, it will definitely measure some amount of activity, but lights can happen for many reasons, and that is where local knowledge, ground level knowledge is important for doing any analysis rather than doing only, you know, number based analysis. My submission is that this is actually what maybe CSO organizations like RBI can take up, that individual researchers like us cannot do because of you know, the amount of resources needed, where you know, how to make these information more useful, better. We can only, as I said, we use the data, and the use shows, you know, where it makes ridiculous conclusions, it shows us something. It shows us that there is something wrong with the data, and that's how we can, you know, keep on bettering the, you know, the process. So sometimes getting ridiculous results is very useful. So that's my point about Amritsar. Second is, you know, the technical point you made, whether to do clustering first and then going for convergence test or not. So that, it all depends on what is your objective here. In economics, we go from theory to empiricism, mostly. And theory tells us, economic growth theory tells us that there should be convergence. So the first thing we test for is whether the data is consistent with that or not. That is why the first thing we do is to show that whether there is, because once there is convergence, then it is consistent with theory. Only when there is no consistency with theory do we start thinking of newer theories. And that is how economic theory itself develops. That when you first build a theory and your data is not supporting it, then you try thinking why it is happening. Maybe we need to change the theory, and that's when we go into club convergence. So the theory of club convergence came afterwards. The theory of convergence precedes that. So that is the reason why this is the sequence in which these tests have been done. But I think in a particular completely different situation, what you suggest may be more useful. And I see, I heard machine learning being used by RBI quite significantly. So increasingly, machine learning is being used for clustering processes very significantly. So maybe that's also another way we can look at it. Using all these new techniques to form clusters and then see whether there is. So, for example, just to take your point further, we are interested in finding whether northeastern states have cluster or coastal states have cluster. So then the obvious thing to do is to first see whether there's convergence within coastal states. So then you collect the coastal states and first look for clustering, and then you can do convergence. So it all depends on the context, what you are trying to do. So in this context, this is how the literature develops.
We had a online seminar, 3 papers relating to using nightlight data were presented, and there also I had made this point that there should be some agency in India to make available researchable nightlight data available on a regular basis, because we did a one-time study with some World Bank researcher who was basically providing us that data, that clean data, and if we have, we can set up a, there's a big data unit being set up in RBI also. Right. So I have made this request there also. But even in NSO, if we can engage, some people to do this kind of data available, make this data available, it will be very useful for research.
Okay, so if there are no other hands raised, Dr. Shastri, if you unmute, we can listen. If you are not able to unmute yourself, it is not possible for us to give you the floor.
Shastri, you see the bottom line of your screen. There is a mic. Near the video sign, there is a mic. Just touch that.
Do we have his contact number? Sony is there? इनका NS शास्त्री साहब का नंबर है? Sorry, not possible. I think it's too much time. नहीं, oh, you are talking to him. Now he will listen.
Sir, your mic is muted on the laptop. So if you want to speak on the phone, put you on the mic. Sir, on the bottom of the screen, there would be certain icons. You're on the top of the screen with a microphone.
Everybody's trying to
What I would suggest is that if you can, I can put you on the microphone here. We can hear you, sir. I'll put you on the microphone here, sir.
Let him speak. This is an ingenious way.
Sir, you can speak now, sir. You're on the mic.
I think time is too much.
Okay. Can I speak now?
Yes, sir.
Are you able to hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And Niti Aayog has used recently for estimating the multiple indicators, multiple level poverty index. Can that be used? Can that be used at the district level? National Family Health Survey, number 5 and number 4.
NFHS is talking about.
Both of them have got district level health data.
Health
And these are used in the Niti Aayog recently to estimate the multiple indicator poverty of the districts. Can you use that data of the multiple poverty index by the Niti Aayog?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
He will take it.
He will take it. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I confirmed on his behalf. Okay, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm not conversant with this technology at all.
Okay.
Sorry?
No, if you, Nivedita Gupta.
Yes, sir.
You know about the National Family Health Survey very well.
Yes, sir.
And Niti Aayog has used it for the multiple poverty index.
So here the main focus is on state domestic product. So I understand that is why he has not directly dealt with multi-dimensional poverty index. So here his purpose was slightly different, to see whether the states or the districts are converging or diverging or converging into different clubs. So that was his main thrust of his discussion and presentation.
But can there be correlation between the GSTP and the multiple poverty index at the state level?
अरे भाई मुश्किल है. Okay. No, he will not be able to listen.
I think I'll look into it. This is a very good suggestion.
Just
You see, kindly try to use the Niti Aayog estimation of the multiple poverty index.
Just he will look into it.
Sure.
National Family Health Survey, district level estimation from National Family Health Survey.
Yes, sir. Surely your suggestion is very well taken. The presenter has promised to look into it. Okay. Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Thank you, sir.
Correlation between the district level and the state level indicator, and then the using for the GSTP and the district level income estimates. That's why it's position.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So I think thanks Praveen for correcting this difficult route. Yeah. Okay. So I request Nivedita to thank the people. Though she has a long one, maybe you could.
No, not at all. Good evening, distinguished guests of the seminar on national accounts organized by IARNIW. On behalf of IARNIW and on my personal behalf, it's my privilege and pleasure to propose vote of thanks. And at the outset, I want to place on record our sincere thanks to Dr. A.C. Kulshrestha and other distinguished members of the executive committee of the association for their continuous guidance and technical support in carrying out the activities of IARNIW in general and today's seminar in particular. Your valuable inputs inspire us to remain relevant to the changing scenario around us. We had 3 presentations, and as you all know, and the first presentation made by Brijendra Singh, he made a very painstaking effort to encapsulate a vast account of discussions, ongoing discussions on SNA 2025 updations being carried out by UNST, and he tried to do it in less than 1 hour's time. So naturally he had to rush with the presentation, and he had made the major aspects of these changes he had tried to highlight, which has rightfully ignited many thoughts among the participants. Our sincere thanks to Dr. Anupam Prakash, Ms. Chaitali Bhaumik, and Mr. Ishu Thakur from Reserve Bank of India. As you usually, nowcasting is performed using monthly indicators, but this paper attempted doing it using weekly indicators, and this definitely gives us a new way of looking at high frequency indicators to gauge the latest development in Indian economy with the least possible time lag. Thank you for very lucid discussion. And the third paper by Professor Sabyasachi was also very interesting, has been very thought-provoking, as we find that this is important to understand the nature of growth process at the level of subnational economy for the purpose of policy formulation. These together with the nightlight data gave some insights into how the newly emerging areas can be attempted for more realistic analysis of data and policy formulation. Thank you, Professor Kaur, for looking beyond convergence and looking into club convergence. I put on record my thanks to all the participants of the seminar who have joined us in person or virtually in spite of very short notice. It gives us immense pleasure to meet and see many of our senior colleagues. In person or virtually in spite of very short notice. Your participation have made it meaningful and successful. And I would thank Scope Convention Center authorities, those providing event management and catering service today, for their support. And lastly, I would fail in my duty if I do not mention the concerted efforts made by my team of officers, especially Dilip Kumar Sinha and Rajiv Kumar from National Accounts Division, in arranging the seminar today. Let us give them a big hand. I thank you one and all. So with this, we conclude the session today. The tea will be served in the, what's the name? Huh? The tea, the high tea. It's not only tea, it's high tea. It's in the lobby. Please join us for the high tea. Thank you.